Okay, members, good morning. Welcome to the Metropolitan Governance Task Force for this Wednesday, January 24th. And we have a packed agenda, and we are going to move through it as quickly as possible. And so I'd really ask, I know we have a very engaged group, but we're going to really need to keep comments brief, and I'm going to actually set some parameters with adoption of these principles. And it's an agenda that Senator Pratt and I both agreed to. So with that, there is a copy of the January 17th minutes in your folders, and I'd ask Representative Wiens if he could move to adopt those.
Mr. Chair, I move to adopt the minutes of the Metro Governance Task Force from January 17th.
Okay, thank you. There's a motion. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, the motion prevails. Okay, we had last week a couple of other members that wanted to add some additional guiding principles for the report. And so what we've decided to do here is that we'll take 5 minutes for each of these, and we'll have the author of the principle give about a minute to share it, and then we can hear a comment in favor and a comment opposed, and then we're going to just need to move on because we could spend the entire day on this, and I think we just need to move on. These are pretty straightforward, and you've seen them before in various capacities. I did ask Representative Wiens and Commissioner Green and Mr. Rockwell to get together and meet, and they've come up with a common format. So we'll just do that, a format that's very straightforward and clear, and you all have seen these ahead of time. So with that, I think I'll call on Representative Wiens first.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. There are 4 different values, principles, criteria that I will be talking about. It's credibility, accessibility, transparency, and collaboration. But I need to take one moment just to set up these 4. As you all know from our public engagement, the top issue was accountability, and we addressed that with the problem statement. The next 4 issues that I just listed were at every one of our public engagement sessions very important. And in fact, as I compose these are characteristics that we value with representative democracy. And in the courses of action for direct elect and COG, these are common values that are shared, or even in a hybrid. Occasionally what you'll have by appointment is that the appointee feels beholden to the appointer. But I will have to say, those are perceptions. There are cases where we have council members. I have a council member, District 11, Dr. Gail Cederberg, by which she answers calls. She provides information. She's collaborative. She's transparent, and gets involved. And she was appointed and selected with a skill set that is appropriate for my district. So that being said, these values really are the representative, the highest standards by which we want our elected officials or those that are council members of a board to participate. So with no further ado, I'll go to Mike Whiskey 1, credibility. I'm using alphanumeric military type chatter here just for those out there that are listening in. But credibility is the first one, and I'll read it. The course of action, or COA, delivers immediate credibility inherent in elected officials, either by local governments or direct elect, who are accountable to their district and operate under the principle of being held accountable for their actions. So I think we're going to take a comment, Mr. Chair, from this, for and against.
Is anyone opposed to this? Chair Cleveland.
Would you read it one more time, please? This is Jim Hovland. Were you referencing only that principle applying to Representative Wiens, applying only to elected officials, or anybody serving on a Metropolitan Council, regardless of how they were chosen or selected?
Mr. Chair and Mr. Mayor, great question. I found that this particular value is best represented by those that are elected officials. However, I think it could be applied to those that are serving in the capacity.
Yeah, I think the principles you're advancing are important ones, and the standard of behavior by anyone, regardless of how they were selected, would be an important observation to make in the context of the standards. So I'd like to see you broaden that out so that we make sure that credibility is a standard that everybody should be abiding by, regardless of how they're selected to be on the Met Council. Because there's an inherent assumption, I think, in what you're saying. The way you've couched your principle is that we're assuming that somebody that gets to be on the Met Council in the future is going to be direct elected or indirectly elected, and that might not be the case. But I think those standards are important.
I agree with you. Mr. Mayor, I'll take that as a friendly amendment, that these are values for anybody that's serving on the board.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Ms. Paddock, and then we'll move on.
Representative Weems, could you say public officials? Would that be a good amendment?
I think that that also, Ms. Paddock, is a favorable amendment, so public officials. So if there's no other comments, I'll reread this particular principle. Credibility. The course of action delivers immediate credibility inherent in public officials who are accountable to their district and operate under the principle of being held accountable for their actions.
Okay, and then Representative Weems, would you then, I think you would need to, I think Mayor Hovland might have the same concern on all of yours, but Senator Dibble?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, of course, don't object to the friendly amendment. Anyone who serves on these decision-making bodies should be credible, accessible, transparent, and collaborative. But I just want to let those who are interested in making the change from elected to public, I'll be listening very closely on how those who might not be connected to an election certificate, we would deliver the credibility, the accessibility, the transparency, and the collaboration that we all say we value. I'm very, very curious to know how that mechanism is enacted so that we fulfill and uphold those values in an environment where the people serving on this body are not connected in any way to an election certificate.
And then we'll take one final comment from Chair Cleavorn.
Thank you. And if these principles are to relate to the Met Council, right, there is accountability and credibility for your district, but there's also accountability and credibility for the region, right? The work of the council is as a regional entity. So to say that you are only accountable to your district leaves out the greater purpose of the Met Council.
Chair Cleavorn, I think from what I heard, I built this based off the public engagement session. And what I heard is that the citizens were concerned about not being represented. And that is the case in the development of these particular principles.
Chair Cleavorn.
Well, there's still, you know, it still runs the issue of being parochial, right? I have an obligation to the citizens that I represent as an elected official, but I also have an obligation to the state, the wellness of the whole, right? And I think the same is true for Met Council, right? It is very clear that people want a seat and a voice at the table. I'm not arguing that. I think that's really to the heart of the work that we all do. But I also think if you're going to serve on a regional entity, you can't ignore the fact that you have a regional obligation as well.
Chair Cleavorn, I think what you'll find in another principle, that's the Mike Whiskey number 4, collaboration. It addresses the collaboration and the regional view. I necked these down so that they're very specific, and I would hope that it would be very apparent and easy for all to agree that these are the 4 key ingredients to a public official.
Would you, would you say, would adding district and region solve this problem?
I have no problem with amending
Yeah.
that so said as adding the district and region to all four of these, I think is what you're saying.
One last question, and I'm wondering if we could just take these four as a package just to move things along. Mr. Rockwell?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, my recommendation was actually to go maybe even further, because there are, for example, Commissioner Green has a regional principle here. If we take all of these as a slate, I think they're complementary. So we've got accountability to the district and Representative Weens, a principal's accountability to the region in Commissioner Green's principle number 2. And so I think looking at them individually, we're going to get into this rut. But I wonder if we're able to just review all of these, take them as a slate, because they're complementary, and I think a lot of the concerns folks have might be addressed by that.
Well, I don't think that proportion, you would support that, Chair Cleavorn?
So the devil's always in the details,
Right,
right? And
right.
there are select words in each of these that could
Correct.
pose problems. So,
Yeah, I think we should just go with each individual's. And I think that we could take Representative Weens's as a slate with those changes. And Ms. Fuller, did you note the changes? Is there any further discussion? Okay, so we'll confirm the changes, and then we'll take a vote on M1 through M4.
To confirm, Rep. Weens, did we amend all of these? So now it says inherent in public officials instead of elected officials? Is that what we're doing, or are we taking?
Mr. Chair, yeah, Ms. Kohler, that is correct, that the elected officials in each of the four will be changed to public officials.
Thank you, Rep. Weens. And then are we removing the language that says either by local government or direct election, or keeping that?
I would like to keep
Okay.
that particular language there. Then there's one other change, and that is by district and region at the end.
Thank you, Rep. Weens.
Okay. Any?
So, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, this is Hovland again. I'm just, while we were having this conversation, I was looking for the definition of public official. All I could find was a definition under Minnesota law of local official, which means an elected or appointed official of a county or city or of an agency. So I'm wondering if we should make sure that language is right, that we have the definition right. Maybe it's local official, but if there's a statutory definition of public official, we should see if that type of definition does indeed exist, because my search is just quick here online.
Well, I think Chair Cleavorn.
so Mayor Hovland, I'm wondering if this doesn't go to the very heart of Professor Orfield's question, what is Met Council, right? And it is organized as a municipality. So I think public official would answer the question, but I'm not a lawyer.
I was thinking the same thing. Professor Orfield.
Yeah, public official is a broad term. I mean, part of it is, I think the principles of this are hard to argue with. They're broad and positive, but they seem, one of the things that upsets me a little bit was allow the present Met Council to fit sort of under these, and there would be no impetus to reform. So I like the broad positive ideas, but I'm not so sure it moves us between any of these ideas particularly. I think the President Council might, unless you wanted to have public elected officials or some other form of accountability, either local elected officials or directly elected officials, you still have the sort of same problem with accountability. And I think the present Met Council, with all of its troubles, could say that they match all these things.
Good idea.
But I do admire the hope of this.
I think that Senator Pratt has a very good way to encapsulate all of these ideas. So Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Weens, I might, since the scope of this is dealing specifically with the Met Council, rather than saying elected officials or public officials, maybe we just say we expect this from our Met Council members, and we change it to Met Council members should be credible, accessible, transparent. And maybe that gets us through some of the definitional problems that we're having.
I kind of think that's a good idea. Okay, so do you want to move that as a, or accept that as a friendly?
Will you accept that as a friendly amendment?
Mr. Chair, I do accept that as a friendly
Okay,
amendment.
so now Ms. Kohler will read that change, and then we'll vote and move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To clarify, what language, are we just making it, getting rid of everything, or can we clarify?
My recommendation, Ms. Coulter, would be that we change where we had elected official and we modified that to public officials, we just say Met Council members.
Thank you. Okay, so now it would say, the COA delivers immediate credibility inherent in Met Council members. No, delivers. Is it inherent in?
I think inherent becomes, I think, an adjective that we would probably strike.
Okay, so we're striking inherent. So the COA delivers immediate credibility in Metropolitan Council members who are accountable to their district.
Here.
All right.
Okay, and then that would apply to all of them, correct?
That is correct. We would strike inherent in elected officials and insert Met Council members.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Is everyone?
And Mr. Chair, would you ask Representative Weens to read the 4 key standards again? I know that we've been talking
And move
about
them.
the first one on credibility.
Yes, Mr. Chair and Mayor Hovland, per request, the 4 are credibility, accessibility, transparency, and collaboration. And I move these as a set, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, I would suggest, so as long as we're taking up all 4, I was going to wait on collaboration. I was going to suggest an addition of a few words under collaboration, if I may.
Please.
I'll offer it either as a friendly, if accepted, or I will ask for a vote if not accepted. And it's just the last 2 words, 3 words says collaborative planning environment. I would change to collaborative planning and service delivery environment.
Representative Weens.
Which, Mr. Chair, just to explain, sorry. The Met Council does far more than many other MPOs in the nation. Beyond planning, it owns and operates a substantial number of direct services.
Representative Weens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, can you state that one more time?
So just kind of reading the last line, under the principle of a nonpartisan collaborative planning and service delivery environment.
Mr. Chair, I find that as a favorable amendment to number 4, collaboration.
Okay.
And with that friendly amendment, then I move all 4 as a slate.
Okay. I don't see any further discussion, so we will vote.
Chair.
So the motion is the Weens MW 1 through 4 with the changes that have been discussed. Okay.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Speckman.
No.
Commissioner Bigham. Senator Coleman. Senator Dibble.
No.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Cleaborn.
Aye.
Representative Koznick. Professor Orfield.
Aye.
Ms. Paddock.
Aye.
Ms. Pereira Webb.
No.
Senator Port.
No.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
Senator Coleman.
Aye.
Aye, 4 no.
Okay. Next, we'll go to, the motion prevails. Next, we'll go to the first principle from Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Weens and Mr. Rockwell, for our work together. So the first MG1 is proportionality. You know, we've talked about quite a bit about that in this room, and as I went through each of the proposals, I found quotes that either describe or name proportionality in pretty much every proposal that was brought forward to this group. So it felt like low-hanging fruit. The language is the course of action, COA, ensures proportional representation so that each member represents the same number of residents.
Okay, discussion? Any opposition? Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under a couple of the proposals, we have versions of whether it's Senator Dibble's hybrid or the COG. There are people on, appointees serving on a version that maybe don't represent the same number of people, and I'm thinking of county commissioners specifically. And so the concern I have is I think while each proposal has proportionality built into it and is truly a value, I don't know that, I'm having a concern with the word each. That we can have proportionality, but if we're saying each and every member must be proportional, then I think that limits our ability to come up with a governance model that may include different folks. If we have a representative from Minneapolis may represent more people than a representative from Scott County.
I know, Commissioner Green, did you want to respond, then Professor Warfield has it.
I'll acknowledge that I wrestled with that too as I looked through, and I thought, well, everybody mentions proportionality, but it means different things in the different formats. And I decided that because this is a document of principles, it's not a document of, definitions, let's say. I think of it as a guiding principle, essentially. And so that's sort of how I came to it.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Pratt, for bringing up the point. And I think there might be a way to solve this dilemma, if you will, or this concern that you raise, and that's somehow or another, and maybe better wordsmiths than I can help, but to kind of flip the proposal and articulate that every citizen of the metropolitan area is represented equally on the body. And I think that's the spirit of what Commissioner Green is trying to achieve, making sure that every citizen, to the point that Mr. Wagenius made in his testimony, that no one no one individual in the metropolitan area is over or underrepresented in the deliberations of this entity. Does that make sense? Because I acknowledge that not every member, because I have 3 different types of members and they're going to have different size districts. We have the direct elect, then the county districts, and the municipal districts, and those are all going to be different sizes. So you articulate and put your finger on something that the wording of the proposal doesn't catch. But I think the idea is we're all equally represented, just like we are in the legislature, on city councils, county commissions, et cetera.
Okay, we need to move this along, and so it sounds like Senator Dibble has a suggestion here, and I'll hear once more from Senator Pratt, and then we'll see if we can come to some agreement here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Dibble, and I appreciate where you're going. I would, I believe the word citizen is probably expected to steer the conversation maybe more one way than another. I feel comfortable that all the proposals have proportionality built into them. I don't know that, and I'm uncomfortable with the wording of this, so I won't be supporting, this is a value. If we were talking about stakeholders, communities, right, we had a little bit more time for a broader definition and reworking. I think it's something we could do, but I have a concern with each because I think it's too limiting, and I'm just concerned that citizen kind of leads the discussion probably more towards the elected perspective than not.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, I will just say categorically it does not. The principle would hold whether we're talking about the Met Council as currently composed, the Met Council under a COG only model, or a blended model. In no way would I advance this idea in light of my desire for there to be elected as part of the mix. I think under any proposal, it would be unacceptable that any citizen be overrepresented on this kind of decision-making body.
Okay, we'll take a comment from, I'm sorry? Mayor Hovland, did you wish to be recognized?
I do, and I don't know if there's a better way to be doing it than the way I'm trying to do it here, but, but anyway, thanks for your patience. I'm just thinking about my experience at the TAP, where we have, by statute, the cities of the first class, which would be Minneapolis and St. Paul, are represented. And then we've got this 34-member body, the majority of whom are elected officials. All 7 counties are represented. And so with Commissioner Green's presentation, with some of the model discussions that are coming up, if we think about somebody being represented, somebody representing a district, let's say of 100,000 people. Well, now Minneapolis may have 3, 4 representatives. And with respect to Senator Dibble's idea, which is laudable, I think, but it seems to me that could create some confusion too, and be at least perceived by some as a backdoor way of achieving this principle of proportionality, where all of a sudden, what I've seen, on the tab as a balanced body that does well in the work that it performs, with the larger cities having a singular representative there, that citizens, in this attempt to have citizens all be equally represented, you could then argue proportionality, and you get back to what I worry about relative to Commissioner Green's position, and that is that the big cities outweigh the others on any kind of a board that gets crafted. So I don't know how to solve the problem. I just raise those as concerns. I think, what I see what Senator Dibble is trying to do, I hear what Senator Dibble is trying to do. I think it's laudable, but I do perceive the language of it to be could be interpreted as being ambiguous and allow a way of achieving some imbalance compared to what I think is the balance that we have now. Thank you.
We have Senator Port, Professor Orfield, and then we'll be done with this one. Professor
Thank you,
Orfield.
Mr. Chair. This is hopefully a friendly amendment to Senator Dibble's suggestion that instead of using the word citizen, we use the word resident. We have a number of communities in our metro area who are not who are not citizens, but are residents and are still represented by the Metropolitan Council.
Sure. See some nodding. Professor Orfield?
Yeah, just as a point of law, and I think we can ask House Research or Senate Counsel or whoever to verify this, but if this body is composed in any other way, the principles of one person, one vote apply. And there's 3 cases that they should think about. One is called Board of Estimate and Taxation versus Morris, which is about the New York boroughs. And in that case, a body exercising this kind of discretion, very similar to the Met Council, was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it violated the principle of one person, one vote. There's also Kramer versus Free Union School District, which is about school boards. And the Supreme Court held that school boards were significant and important enough so that all people should have an equal vote. You couldn't just have parents and property owners vote. So, and it would also be unconstitutional under that principle. And finally, there's Reynolds versus Sims, where the Supreme Court says that anything that has the taxing and discretionary powers would have to be one person, one vote. Finally, there's redesignation, which is brought up often as a horrible by the Met Council. The one thing that truly triggers redesignation, and Jim Urkel is here as an expert on this, he could certainly speak to the committee, is if the central city is disenfranchised. That is the one factor that triggers redesignation in the whole statute. It's the only thing that triggers
Thank you,
and
yes.
any principle that would dilute the central city's power on the MPO would automatically trigger redesignation. Elected council would not. The USDOT has said that, but this certainly would. So any move to make this body not proportional with these kinds of taxing powers would violate at least 3 Supreme Court decisions. And I would ask, I obviously am not credible on this committee, but House Research or Senate Counsel, I think could confirm.
Well, thank you. I think that Senator Dibble and Commissioner Green are working on revised language, and we'll have that here, and then we'll take action. Okay, so Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered in hearing the conversation, and thank you, Senator Pratt, for sharing your concerns. I wondered about an amendment to say the course of action ensures equal representation. That way we get rid of the word that I think raised some concerns for you and address the legal issues and also reflect something that I think really, even this morning is reflected as a core value of this group.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Mr. Chair, I just want to ask a clarifying question. We are really digging into the weeds of redistricting and what is permissible by law. And I think we do have to acknowledge Professor Orfield's opinions here. We don't want to be in contradiction of federal law in any way. The purpose of these principles is merely advisory.
Correct.
We are not putting anything into statute.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
So the idea of equal representation, right? The idea of the intent is to make sure that voices are heard equally.
Correct.
I think we have to be careful about what we're actually doing. These are merely recommendations and suggestions. It's not like we're putting in statute that says these are the redistricting principles you will be following, right?
Correct.
So I just want to make that clear.
Mr. Chair, clarification.
Commissioner Bingham.
We are 40 minutes into this meeting.
Yeah.
And we have till noon.
Yeah.
And we have a report to write.
Right.
To Representative Cleburne's point. That's the point of this task force. And so we've spent quite a bit last week doing this. A lot of people have spent a lot of hours this week doing this. can we just trust in the process, please, and each other, that these principles really do reflect the 6 months that we've spent together, and move on to do the report, which is what's expected of us next week, and to really know that the legislature is the one that is going to have to enact what we're doing, and we're guiding that process of the 201, plus the governor who has to enact this, so that we can have the discussion about the proposals and the motions that are ahead of us. That's just all I'm asking.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, to Commissioner Bigum's point, I would love to say yes, but now I'm hearing people say quite clearly that they want to dilute the voice of people who live in Minneapolis, their representation, their ability to have access, transparency, collaboration, accountability, all the other things that they say they want when they say, oh, but when it comes to Minneapolis, they can have lesser representation on this body that controls billions of dollars in vital services that is crucial to the success and prosperity of their families and their lives. So frankly, my level of trust has diminished greatly in the context of this discussion. And so if we're not going to offer a motion that upholds, I think, just an easy, basic principle of equal representation that is foundational to the fundamentals of democracy, whether or not this is an elected body, it's something that if you go out on the street and ask anyone passing by that whether or not they would agree that an important body like this would have more people, would have more say in different parts of the jurisdiction than other people, they would laugh. If we were to advance a set of principles that suggests that we do that would undermine the credibility of the entire report. This is foundational. Equal representation. So yes, I'll make a motion. The course of action ensures proportional wait a second here. I think I changed.
Equal representation.
Yeah, the course of action ensures there is equal representation for all residents.
Okay, we have a motion on the table.
What was the last part?
The course of action ensures there is equal representation for all residents.
Okay. I don't see any
Friendly.
discussion, further discussion, so Ms. Kohler.
Chair Hornstein, do you just want me to read it out again? Otherwise, Ms. Olson's going to read the roll call.
Do people want to hear that? Okay, we'll just go to the roll call.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Pass.
Ms. Beckman.
Aye.
Commissioner Bigum.
Aye.
Senator Coleman. Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Claiborne.
Aye.
Representative Koznick. Professor Orfield.
Aye.
Ms. Paddock.
Aye.
Ms. Pereira Webb.
Aye.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
Senator Coleman. Senator Pratt.
Aye.
15 aye, 1 no.
Okay, the motion prevails, and we will go on to the last couple here. And if, Commissioner Bingham, if this goes past 10 o'clock, we'll just end it at that point. So I really, if people want their, COAs to be included, please be very brief in explaining those. So I do believe, Commissioner Green, maybe your regional interest was already covered. I don't know if you feel that way in one of the amendments for Representative Weens, or do you want to just
I do
do
not
this
feel that way.
separately? What's that?
I do not feel that way.
Okay.
But I'd be
then-
happy to very quickly present it. So
Okay.
both COG and directly elected proposals aimed for this sort of regionalism. And so to read the proposal, the COA provides a regional orientation whereby Met Council members are locally selected. Again, I could like list each one of the proposals that reflected this, but you know, either by COG or direct election, pretty much every proposal, yes, every proposal reflects this.
Mayor Hovland.
Yeah, it seems to me that this is another one of those fundamental principles that is important to consider. I just hope that Commissioner Green would think about the fact that if the existing model continued in some form, that there be consideration given to that nominating committee process for, we might shift that a little bit where there's not a nominating committee that recommends people from all 16 districts, but there could be local nominating committees from each district that do that work and recommending those appointments to the governor. So that, I don't think she meant her remarks, I don't want to speak for her, she can speak for herself, but I'd like to make sure that her remarks include not only the consideration of the COG or direct elected, but also the nominating process or a variation of what we use right now would also apply. And because I like the idea of it, that the representatives on the Met Council for each district should be locally selected. I think that's important.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mayor Hovland. That was my intent.
Thank you.
Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Green, could you just clarify the intent of the locally elected? Some might argue that, or excuse me, locally selected. Some might argue that the current model has encompasses that. Is that your intent to, or are you trying to differentiate from the current model?
Commissioner Green.
My intent is to differentiate from the current model, but I do think it's shades of gray. Because even as Mayor Hovland just outlined, and I thought of this as I read his proposal, and where he talked about changing the nomination process, it's pulling it more local. It's not making a gigantic shift, but he was suggesting in his proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the response there for clarification, and we won't wordsmith it to death, but I understand the intent, so thank you. I look forward to supporting it.
I think it could be your proposal too could apply to this. Senator Dibble, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Commissioner Green. I hate to slow this down because I do want to get on to things. So I'm sorry to ask a question, but and I agree with this, except that my proposal brings in the idea of three gubernatorial appointees at large. Would the spirit of this principle allow for that to occur?
In my opinion, yes. I thought Ms. Beckman's words last week were notable, and I appreciated how you had incorporated that in your proposal. And again, it is shades of gray a little bit. And I think this is an idea that we're all interested in, and of course, how it's expressed will be figured out. And I want to thank Commissioner Bingham for her remarks, because it's all, with each of these, the devil's in the details, and it's going to be out of our hands.
Right. So, Mr. Chair, I will not wordsmith this and will accept legislative intent and support this principle.
Okay. All right, any further discussion? Okay, Ms. Olson.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Ms. Beckman.
No.
Commissioner Bingham.
Aye.
Senator Coleman. Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Cleaborn.
No.
Representative Koznick.
Aye.
Professor Orfield.
Aye.
Ms. Paddock.
Aye.
Ms. Pereira-Webb.
No.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
Senator Coleman,
Aye.
14 aye, 3 no.
Okay. We're moving right along.
Mr. Chair, I'll move quickly into MG3.
Okay.
Compensation. The COA includes the establishment of compensation and resources necessary for Met Council members commensurate with the level of responsibility entrusted to them. So this works to acknowledge what we discussed last week. We don't know what model we're commenting on, but we want to support the Met Council in whatever way is appropriate, given their responsibility, if they have a lot or a little. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Discussion?
Could you restate the principle again, please, the standard?
Yes, the course of action includes the establishment of compensation and the resources necessary for Metropolitan Council members commensurate with the level of responsibility entrusted to them.
Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion? Representative Kozny.
Thank you. Just briefly, I won't be supporting this. I think the issue that you raise, and I've heard it as well outside of the Capitol, I'm just not comfortable putting this into a legislative recommendation, but I think it will likely be and could be something that the legislature would address, but it's a little vague for me at this point.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Representative Cleaborn.
I think that there could be discussion around compensation with the Compensation Commission that already exists in statute. So I don't think that we really need to be putting this in here, but maybe a recommendation that the legislature would consider adding Met Council as an entity under the Compensation Commission that's already in existence.
Good point. We'll hear from Senator Dibble, and then if Commissioner Green wants to adjust her proposal, we'll do that.
I just want to speak in favor of the proposal. I think we've heard from a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives that this would be very fundamental to any proposal that advances that. That currently we ask people to do a gigantic job in a very, very part-time basis with a minimal amount of reimbursement, and that if they're to really spend the time focused on the task at hand, it needs to be a full-time job. And the only way to accomplish that, of course, is if they're paid on a full-time basis. I just want to remind everyone, this is billions of dollars in appropriations and taxing authority, and billions of dollars in actual infrastructure that is owned and services delivered, and decisions that affect the everyday lives of people. And so asking folks to tend to these as a side hustle while they're pursuing full-time professional careers is really, really difficult. And I just think it's an easy one. Thanks.
We're going to hear from Commissioner Bingham, Ms. Paddock, and then we'll wrap this up.
I just want the record to state a couple things. One, that the metro area commissioners all come up on the cap to the governor. So I just want the record to state that the commissioners on any sort of COG hybrid would not be able to accept any additional compensation. I also want to say that I believe the idea that Representative Chair Cleaborn just put forward is probably the right policy approach. And three, that I agree with Senator Dibble that the folks that would sit on any said body should be compensated for the time and efforts that they put forward on this, because it is a large amount of money and a daunting task that they have with all the responsibilities that are included, whatever comes out of the recommendation and comes out of the legislature.
Ms. Paddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would also read this as meaning that the Met Council members would have appropriate staffing and other, say, research resources, and this would help us steer away from the current staff-driven model that a number of us have mentioned. This seems to orient the resources more towards helping the members rather than helping the, the staff orientation.
Final comment, Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank you, Ms. Paddock. That's exactly what I was going to also highlight, was that as others have shared, the Met Council has a huge budget, $1.4 billion budget, and this is designed to address also the resources that support the body. And so that's an important element here that I don't want to overshadow.
Okay, no further discussion. Ms. Olson.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
No.
Ms. Beckman.
Aye.
Commissioner Bigham. Senator Coleman. Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
No.
Representative Cleaborn.
No.
Representative Koznick.
No.
Professor Orfield.
Aye.
Ms. Paddock. Ms. Pereira-Webb.
Aye.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
Senator Coleman.
No.
12 yes, 5 no.
Motion prevails. Okay, our last one, and I think this could be quick. If not, we'll set it aside. Mr. Rockwell.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take 20 seconds to explain it. We have talked a lot about accountability of the Met Council members and how that plays out in the structure of how they get into their seats. I think it is also critical that the public understands who they are accountable to, so that when the public is advocating for action, that the public is able to realize that they have a vote at the ballot box, or that the governor appoints the members, or that the members are COG members appointed through X process or voted into office by X constituency, so that the citizens and residents actually have the ability to put pressure on the council and the council members and therefore have accountability to the public. So that's the intent behind this, applying to any governance model, that the COA, this is the language, COA delivers actual rather than just perceived accountability to the public by ensuring that the public knows and understands to whom Met Council board members are accountable to on an ongoing basis.
Professor Orfield.
I support this motion. I think there is pretty good guidance in the statute. Orderly and economic development is a term of art. It has a good meaning, but certainly I support this. But I do so also believing that the statute has quite a bit of guidance.
Any further discussion? Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and maybe I bring a little bit different perspective to this. I certainly appreciate where you're coming from. We've heard from our public testimony that it's a problem. I also think there's a responsibility on the citizens to consume the information. I can go out to the Met Council website and I can figure out who represents me. I can look at a map. I see the same thing with my city council, with my county commissioners. I'm not quite sure this, on the ongoing basis piece, as Professor Orfield mentioned, we have statutes already that probably cover this. I'm trying to figure out why this is a principle that we would need to incorporate and the value for it. And right now I'm inclined to vote against the proposal just because I don't fully understand it and because I think there's a responsibility of residents to do some legwork. We can provide the data. They have a responsibility to consume it.
Mr. Rockwell.
To respond, Mr. Chair, totally hear that. I think what we've heard from folks in public testimony is they know who their Met Council member are if they're doing the research, but the Met Council members are not accountable to anybody. That's what we've heard them say. So I am executive director of an advocacy group, and I spend more time than the average citizen thinking about this, and so I know to go to the governor staff when we're asking for example, a particular budget request for transit, right? We go to the governor's staff, not to the Met Council board members, because the governor's staff is the one who actually makes that decision. But the general public doesn't know to do that and doesn't know to put pressure in that direction. And I think it's really important that, like, if the Met Council members are not actually accountable to the public, which we have heard, they represent a district, but not accountable to the public, that they understand who the Met Council members are accountable to so that they can apply the appropriate pressure the way we, the professional advocates, do.
Mayor Hovland. Unmute, please.
Would Mr. Rockwell restate his principle, please?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Hovland, the COA delivers actual rather than just perceived accountability to the public by ensuring that the public knows and understands to whom Met Council board members are accountable to on an ongoing basis.
Thank you.
Discussion. Senator Dibble, and then we'll vote.
I'll just say I'm in favor. This is a basic bedrock principle, and I agree with the points that Mr. Rockwell made in support of his motion.
Okay. Ms. Paddock, and then we are going to vote.
In one of our public hearings, we heard from somebody who lives in my area. She's as knowledgeable about public affairs as any one of us sitting around the table here. And she tried to contact the person who had been her Met Council representative for years. And he said, oh, I'm not your representative anymore. There was redistricting, and nobody was notified. Nobody knew. And then the person that she did talk to told her, the person who was her new representative refused to talk to her and had a staff member talk to her instead. So I've been a public information officer for literally decades in my life, and in that position, you have to be cognizant of who your public is. And the Met Council is not a high level like a city council or whatever. It's probably even lower level visibility than county board members, and there is a responsibility for them to make sure that they solve that public information problem. So I would support this.
Okay, Ms. Olson.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
No.
Ms. Beckman.
Aye.
Commissioner Bigham. Senator Coleman.
No.
Senator Dibble.
Yes.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
No.
Representative Claiborne.
No.
Representative Koznick.
No.
Professor Orfield.
Aye.
Ms. Paddock. Ms. Pereira-Webb.
Aye.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
12 yes, 5 no.
Okay, that concludes, I believe, the principles. And now we're going to move into the proposals that are before the body. We've heard a number of them, we have a few additions to proposals that are previously heard, but we're going to have some strict time limits here. And I'm going to start with Commissioner Green. We're going to have 10 minutes for this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, fellow members. So given where we are at in our discussions and the way our meeting is going today, I will really try to keep this extremely high level, and I welcome questions even offline if that's preferable. So this proposal for an elected Met Council came together in an effort to design for, as I say, accountability, transparency, and simplicity, proportionality, and regional vision. A model that would be simple for the public to understand and that supports a built-in spark for regional vision. The point that I'm going to emphasize in my brief remarks is accountability. So as I mentioned earlier, the Met Council has a budget this year of $1.4 billion. That's public money. That's the hard-earned money of our residents. I will acknowledge 15% of it is federal dollars, but it's money that really demands the utmost care and scrutiny to ensure that it's well spent and to ensure that whoever's setting the budget and setting the priorities for the budget is responsible and accountable to the public trust. There is not an appointed body in Minnesota that comes even close to having a budget of $1.4 billion. For a little bit of context about how big that is approaching 2 times the 2024 budget for Ramsey County. It's 3.8 times the 2004 budget of Washington County. It's 7.5 times the 2024 budget of the city of Edina. It's 12.5 times the 2024 budget of the city of Plymouth. In my own district, it's 17 times the 2023 budget for the city of St. Louis Park. It's 30 times the 2024 budget of the city of Chanhassen, and it's 14 times the combined budgets of Lakeville, Shakopee, and Cottage Grove. So that is a big budget. In all of these jurisdictions, the public have a direct say in who determines the budget. There's not an appointed body, as I mentioned, that has this sort of scope and power. So to the details of the proposal, I think it's pretty straightforward as on the paper. Directly elected, districts proportional by population, constituents are the residents, the size, something similar to the current, but I didn't want to sort of get wrapped around an axle figuring that out exactly, deciding even, nonpartisan, much as I think county board elections are successfully nonpartisan, 4-year staggered terms, governed by open meeting law to help engender that transparency that we're seeking, full-time, salaried, staffed. I think those 3 sort of go part and parcel when I see a budget the size of $1.4 billion. The group elects their own chair. They choose the regional administrator. It's redistricted after the census, much like the redistricting processes for the current Met Council and for those of us who are elected. And the responsibilities I propose remain similar to
Okay,
current.
thank you. Questions, comments? Ms. Beckman?
Thank you, Chair. I just have a general comment. So I submitted a motion, I think everyone saw it, that is later in the proposal where I would just like all the ideas sent on to the report. And I largely do that because I feel like 10 minutes per proposal is just not enough to suss out legislative intent, maybe things that are not being said and are between the lines. And so I really do believe that we haven't, all of these ideas need more vetting and thought, and I'd like the legislature to pick up our work and go forward. So I'm voting no on every proposal, not on the merits of the proposal, but on kind of process. And in being consistent with the motion that I guess will be moved later on in the packet.
Yeah, we're not voting on these right now, just discussing, but I understand we'll be hearing more from you later. Ms. Beckman. Commissioner Bingham.
As the representative for the Association of Minnesota Counties and with the support of the advisors from the Association of Minnesota Counties, 6 of the 7 counties oppose a true direct elect as Commissioner Green has proposed. So I will not be supporting this measure.
Representative Koznick.
Thank you, and if we were voting, I wouldn't be supporting this, but, my problem is, and I appreciate the task force ability to say it publicly, is that this adds another layer of government with taxation and service delivery mandates, and it's really inviting in the Twin Cities areas all the problems that we saw in Portland, and we had that testimony come in. And it really just, in my mind, creates a mini legislature with taxing authority, disenfranchises the local townships, the cities, and the counties, and those local elected people and disenfranchises their election certificates to help set the vision and the planning more locally. And so I think there's a lot of problems with the direct elected. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mayor Hovland, Senator Dibble, Professor Orfield, and we'll move on.
Thank you,
Mayor.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I think Representative Koznick stated the position of the cities as well. And I just have to go back to my personal experience from being a local elected official and serving on the tab for over a decade now. I see all the good work that gets done with the existing model. And when I think about over the past decade plus with the Citizens League, the Special Blue Ribbon Committee, the League of Women Voters, all looking at the model that we have right now and suggesting subtle changes that create some real effectiveness in terms of staggered terms and other slight little changes that could make a significant difference with respect to more effective representation by district. I don't think that we've dug deep enough into the work that needs to be done here. So I thought Ms. Beckman's suggestion was a good one. When I look at the task that we were charged with under the statute that was passed, we were supposed to look at all of these models and do a risk-benefit analysis on each one of them. We've never done that. We've just talked about the direct election model. We've talked about the cost. We've gotten a pretty good sort of threshold level education, but we haven't done the deep dive work that, in my opinion, that was requested of us. And so I think the best thing to do is to follow Ms. Beckman's ideas, and that is to send all these notions to the legislature and let them wrestle with them. I realize that you want some votes on some things, but with respect to direct elect, I also joined Representative Koznick in saying I think it's an unnecessary expense. I think anyone that gets directly elected, they're going to think of themselves as super county commissioners. And I see a budgetary burden here that's unnecessary for the taxpayers through a direct elect. When I compare it to the work that gets done now, I just don't think on balance it's worthwhile. Those are my comments.
Professor Orfield, and then we're going to go to Senator Dibble and then to Mayor Hovland's proposal.
I think that I support Commissioner Green's proposal. In America, when we create bodies that have broad discretion and taxing power, it is our deep and almost unbroken tradition that they be elected. The framers of the Constitution believed that there was a right to locally elected government. That was the foundation of our democracy. No, the Met Council, by its answers, said it was a local government. It cited cases about municipalities. There's no municipality in the United States isn't directly elected and apportioned one person, one vote. In the rare instances when cities are taken over by states in insolvency, and appointed officials are put in place, they have very limited powers. They don't have the power to create law. They don't have the power to enact taxes. They don't have the power to issue bonds. They're caretakers. We do not entrust this kind of power to appointed officials in this country. It's deeply inconsistent with our tradition.
Thank you. And finally, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the Green proposal. I like mine better. but this, really gets to the nut of the principle of direct election for all the reasons that Professor Orfield articulated. And rather than problems from Portland, I saw a lot of virtue and a lot of benefit from the Portland model. I didn't hear a lot of problems. So I think there's a lot to be commended in this proposal, although I'm probably going to go with the Beckman motion to kind of move everything forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Last comments, and then we move on to Mayor Hovland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My last comment is to thank Senator Dibble and others who have come before me in this conversation about a directly elected Met Council.
Thank you. Thanks for keeping the time limits, folks. Mayor Hovland, you're next up with your proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned in my prior comments, my suggestions are consistent with, I think, the suggestions that have been made in the past from the Citizens League, from the Blue Ribbon panel of the governor that just finished its work less than 3 years ago, and also the League of Women Voters. And that is to maintain the present geography of each district and the number of districts and the district membership on the Met Council in its present configuration of 16. Go to a staggered term situation where we have 4-year staggered terms of Met Council members, which would reduce ideological shifts, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of Metro cities. reduce those ideological shifts in the makeup of the council based on who's in the governor's office, and allow for knowledge and experience continuity of council members, which is really critical because it's a really complicated area of operation. An increase in the number of members on the statutory nominating committee to 15 if we're going to have one statutory nominating committee. I did vote in favor of locally selected. What I really meant was locally nominated. I still think the governor ought to have the authority, but I think he should have a more limited sort of authority. You ought to pick from the group that's selected. So I have no real angst over whether we use the nominating committee model that we're using now. If we do, we should expand it to 15 in number. And I think because of the makeup of our region, it should have a slightly favorable elected officials with 8 in number, 4 locally elected officials, 3 county elected officials, 1 township elected official on that broad nominating committee. That could be a variation of a model you use district by district too, if necessary. And then the nominating committee would submit the names of the 3 finalists from each district to the governor, and the governor would be required to select from amongst those 3 finalists selected by the nominating committee in each district. And of course, the proof is in the pudding. You've got to make sure that you've got your nominating committee properly structured so that folks can do an effective job of delivering names to the governor of people that are actually qualified to do the work. So that's it in a nutshell, Mr. Chair. It's, as I say, a subtle variation of what we're doing now, but I think it doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It recognizes, at least in my experience, that we've been doing really good work over at the Met Council and the TAB. And I don't think we should do anything but take careful steps here as we work on recommendations that might be made to the legislature. Thank you.
Chair Cleavorn and Chair Dibble.
Thank you, and Mayor Hovland, I appreciate your proposal. I will be supporting Ms. Beckman's motion later, but I just wondered if you would add to this a friendly recommendation that the legislature have the compensation committee review the compensation currently provided to see if it is commensurate with the duties that are required of the current Met Council members. And also if you would maybe consider, and since you and I have not talked, I know this is catching you off guard, review by the legislature of possible inclusion of staffing requirements for the council members.
Yes, those are good thoughts. I'd be comfortable with that, those 2 items being included in my motion.
Okay, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we were voting on this, I would vote no. I view it as the status quo offering. It makes some changes, but I think they're largely aesthetic and really won't move the ball forward in the ways that I think we have been engaged in deep discussion with a lot of stakeholders and members of the public, and the kind of shift in accountability measures that are sorely needed. Not to speak of the basic principle at stake, which is the broad discretionary powers and authorities that Professor Orfield talks about, that cries out for more public accountability. This means that the domain of the Met Council will still be within entirely highly connected, highly knowledgeable group of very, very, very few people in the metro area who would know about the arcana of this process and know how to access it, and the public would be largely shut out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Very briefly, Professor Orfield.
Yes, I think that the status quo is unacceptable for a lot of reasons. I say this as the author of the status quo, the person that passed this law, and at the time I had grave misgivings about this. And I thought about this a lot. I teach local government law. The Met Council said it's a local government. I think if a court looked at it, I think a court would say it was an agency. And I think it would be unconstitutional. I think that the powers to tax, the Attorney General's already said, are unconstitutional. Certainly the discretion's too broad. I say this in the sense that state courts have upheld all sorts of wild arrangements for local governments, and they've been very flexible in allowing states to experiment. But I think something of this magnitude, there's nothing like this of this magnitude anywhere in the United States. There's nothing with this kind of power, this kind of discretion. It looks mostly like a large municipality, a super municipality, if anything else, but it is appointed at will by officials that I think a court would term executive officers. So I believe that it is presently very unstable and maybe one of the few configurations in the United States a court might actually strike down.
Thank you. Mayor Hovland, did you have any closing comments?
I do not, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you for your proposal. And now, Commissioner Bingham, I understand you have an idea.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to pass on that. I'm a former whip. I can count votes, so pass. I can do my other two, or the other three motions, if that's what you're referring to.
Well, we're going to, those are going to
I
be
mean,
after.
Mr. Chair, I can elaborate, but the discussion has enlightened when Ms. Beckman made her announcement, and I can count by the people who have said this. My opinion is that if Ms. Beckman's proposal goes forward, it doesn't give clarity to the governor of what to do. It doesn't give clarity to the legislature of what to do. I'm in the position of the Blue Ribbon Commission, which essentially was, saying, kind of punted to the legislature, and we're in 2024, and they really didn't enact a lot of change. So I was more hopeful that this commission would have more of a direction. And that's not going to happen if Ms. Beckman's proposal goes forward.
Well, we
So
can debate
what
that.
I would have hoped, because I believe that Senator Dibble and Senator Pratt had done a lot of work, a lot of negotiation, a lot of movement, for those of us that have followed this, to basically say Senator Dibble's proposal, Senator Pratt's proposal goes forward as a recommendation into the report, then let the legislature deal with that. That would have been what I was suggesting. I was hoping that we would have the vote, but it sounds as if the decision has been made, that's not going to happen, and we're going to just put everything in a stew and let it simmer. And I believe just punting this to the legislature is from a governance perspective, is not giving clarity to them. So that's regrettable. But what I will do is I do have three other motions.
Okay.
Since there's not an appetite to kind of do the other one. I can move on with my other three.
Well, I know that Senator Pratt and Senator Dibble had some adjustments to their proposals that we wanted to hear first. So, yeah.
Could we
Is
have
this a governance?
clarification on which motion you're passing on?
Yeah. We're really still looking at governance proposals at this point, Commissioner?
Right, and mine was to move Senator Dibble and Senator Pratt's forward as a recommendation. So either you want to
okay.
let those two go forward, or do you want me to go forward with mine,
Well,
Mr. Chair?
I think it would be Senator Dibble.
With the indulgence. Excuse me, with the indulgence of, I don't know what your motions are, so I don't want to preempt them, but I will just, for the benefit of Commissioner Bingham and the body, my adjustments I can describe in 60 seconds or less.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll do that. I think the revised, it doesn't say revised, and also I made a couple of mistakes that I need to call your attention to quickly. So it's the Senator Dibble proposal, I reorganized it slightly. And it's basically the same proposal. I just wanted to be clear that the second bullet under the Regional Civic Council membership and selection, when it says all districts to be equal in size by population. And then Commissioner Green's proposal reminded me that, the idea of redistricting every 10 years should probably be a part of this package for both the local government council and the Regional Civic Council. And then I just wanted to call members' attention to a couple of changes under roles and responsibilities. I would propose that the Regional Civic Council share in equal measure with the local government council the responsibility for planning. And then the mistake I made is in that line where it says, planning responsibility and authority to be shared equally with the local government council. And then the exact same paragraph should be dropped down to the local government council section on roles and responsibilities, although, of course, the term civic council should be inserted there. And what I mean by that is that the 10-year long-range plan and then the ancillary plans that flow from the long-range plan, the transportation policy plan, water resources, regional parks, housing, et cetera, would need to receive an affirmative vote by both entities. I would, just to be clear, I think it was implied in my previous presentation, the Regional Civic Council would be the designated MPO. I think I had mentioned in the previous version that the Civic Council would have a dedicated fiscal and research and analysis staff. I wanted to be clear that that is a staff that's accountable only to the Civic Council, as well as, of course, the staff that would help them with their individual office work. And then, moving on, I would, in addition to the planning authority to be shared with the Civic Council, the local government council would be entirely responsible for the evaluation side of the equation for services that have been provided to ensure that they're effective, efficient, consistent with law and policies, et cetera. That's that idea of separating out the delivery of transit and then who gets to evaluate whether or not that transit has been effective. We would put that in the hands of the local government officials who are named to the local government council. And then I would also provide a dedicated fiscal and research and analysis staff to them for the purposes of their need for information in their deliberative process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I think I was under the impression you had a proposal, so.
Mr. Chair, the proposal is to have Senator Dibble and Senator Pratt's, both of their proposals as presented.
Right.
Be recommendation as the two proposals that have not the majority consensus or a unanimous consensus, but I would say that have the most consensus between the two of them. They have a blend of everybody's, right? And again, I'm just going to say it's a disservice and no direction, just to say they're all moving forward. Have a nice day.
We're getting ahead of ourselves here. Thank you, Commissioner Bingham. We haven't heard from Senator
Yeah.
Pratt. He has some ideas here, too.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members. And in your packet, I've got, I think to Mayor Hovland's concern before, at least some sort of kind of take on where the various proposals meet on some of the criteria that we've established along the way. I still believe that the modified Council of Governments is our best course of action. You know, when we talk about a Council of Governments and we hear about some of the concerns that we're talking generally about councils of governments that aren't proportional. Where maybe Spring Lake Township in Scott County has the same vote as the city of Bloomington. And we do have that principle now adopted that will be moving forward. But I'm going to just kind of go through some thoughts and then talk about the changes, because I guess I'm kind of looking at this like ice cream, where the proposal one is vanilla, and then, you know, along the way, it's to show that we have the ability to create a strawberry, a chocolate, maybe a Neapolitan mint chocolate chip.
You're making me hungry.
But at the heart of both proposals, and they're very similar, is to have those most impacted represented on the Met Council. Cities and counties are the ones governed by the Met Council in many cases. They have density requirements, they have comp plan approval, they have transportation project approval, just to name a few. There are 420 regional planning organizations in the nation. There's one appointed, our Met Council. There's one elected, Portland Transit, and the rest are some sort of version of a council of governments where our residents have elected their representatives already, who then take that voice up to the Regional Planning Commission. And they're all effective in their own way. I mean, it's not that they've been ineffective, which is probably why it's the predominant model that we see across the nation. You know, locally elected officials can address the individual needs of their communities. You know, one of the things that I noticed when we had the public testimony were the stark differences between the urban sessions and the suburban sessions. And yet we're tasked with creating a Met Council that represents all of those beliefs and all of those needs. And by having our locally elected officials, our locally elected representatives carry that voice forward for their communities. And then also to be a partner. Because one of the things we haven't discussed much is what the scope of the Met Council should be. When we're talking about compensation, when we're talking about staffing, we're presuming that the Met Council stays within the scope that it is. And my hope is with having locally elected officials on the Metropolitan Council, we get a better chance to decide what tasks the Met Council should be handling on a regional basis and what should be transferred to our local governments. There's a perception that the Met Council is not as collaborative as it should be. And we just passed collaboration as a principle. Yet, even Lynn Peterson mentioned that in their elected Met Council, they're having controversy with their local governments. They're making decisions that their local governments don't agree with. When we heard from Denver, they highlighted, they celebrated their ability to work together. And communities that disagreed with the final outcome all felt like they had a voice to make their case, that it was fair. And I think that's what we're really looking for in a Metropolitan Council. It reflects the needs of the communities represented by their members and members that have already been elected to represent their concerns. You know, one of the things I thought about as I was listening to the public sessions and particularly in urban when they were talking about the virtues that would be conferred upon someone who was elected, I actually thought to myself that could be someone who was directly elected, or that's something that we would expect, that's something that we would confer upon a locally elected official as well as they took to their work at the Metropolitan Council. We want a Metropolitan Council that's going to be independent of special interest. When you've looked at the campaign finance reports for some of the Metro Portland folks, I've seen expenses and donations from partisan groups, from special interest groups, from out-of-state stakeholders. And we want this Metropolitan Council, we've talked about it, to represent the residents of the metropolitan region. We've heard concerns that COGS are ineffective, and as I mentioned, we want to make sure there's proportionality, and I think both of the proposals I put forward that are very similar do that. The secondary proposal is kind of a hybrid with what Mayor Hovland had proposed, to say that we'll allow a non-elected official to serve on the Metropolitan Council in one of these districts, And they will select a number to, up to 3 members that the governor could then choose from. But it's the locally elected people who are making that decision on who gets up. And then the governor would select from that slate. And I think we could look at these 2 proposals and see that there's a lot of movement, a lot of negotiation that could happen once we get into the legislature. But one thing that both versions do, and we haven't talked a lot about it here, is increase the size of the Met Council. As Mayor Hovland mentioned earlier, the tab has 34 members on it, and they get their work done. They're fairly effective. Nationally, there are larger planning organizations than our Met Council, and they've been roughly effective. We have one of the largest, we have the largest Senate in the nation. And I believe that's, I wasn't around in 1972 when we set that, but I believe that's to make sure that our legislators are accessible to those that they serve. And when you have a metropolitan area of almost 3.5 million people served by 16 representatives, I don't know that you get that accessibility. I don't know that you get that accountability, especially when you have competing interests. So, Mr. Chair, I would say that I still prefer Proposal 1, which is the modified COG, but also to at least offer to the group the idea that there can be flexibility in making sure the voices of our cities and counties who are responsible for implementing the policies of the Metropolitan Council have a direct voice at the table.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the work you've done on this, and I think your grid is a good one as well. So Professor Orfield, and then we'll have Ms. Pereira-Webb, and then Ms. Beckman.
I'd like to just ask Senator Pratt to clarify his comments. I support Senator Dibble's proposal as an enormous compromise, a huge tectonic change to recognize the concerns of people like Senator Pratt and the people that believe there should be county officials and local officials more deeply involved. I support it as a compromise. I believe that Commissioner Green's proposal is superior in my mind, but in the effort to compromise, I would support Senator Dibble's huge concessions. I don't think we should be bargaining against ourselves. If Senator Dibble is offering this and there's nobody biting on this, I see no reason to do it. But I think it's a huge diplomatic compromise that is seeking to try to deal with the criticisms and recognize Senator Pratt's criticisms. But if there's no takers, I don't think we should bargain against ourselves.
Anyone else? Senator Dibble.
Thanks. I wanted to just say for the record, because I didn't spend a lot of time arguing in favor of my proposal this time, that in fact my proposal does include a COG that has all the elements and values and upholds and drives an important discussion. I don't actually view necessarily that my proposal is a move backwards or an accommodation. It's a recognition that we need to drive a very powerful discussion between the regional government and the locally elected governments. And this does so in a very, very powerful way with very, very strong powers granted to the local government council. The power to share equally planning, the requirement that all major policy decisions be consulted, their power to force a reconsideration of every decision, the power to veto a decision, and the power to evaluate everything that's been done by the Metropolitan Council as directed by the Civic Council, and the power to have in equal measure with with 50% of the votes, a membership on all of the committees. So as each policy, each decision, each appropriation, each decision to tax moves its way through the deliberative process, the committee process, up to final decision by the Civic Council, the local government council is represented with an equal number of votes in that committee deliberative process. And it's done so in a way that shows fairness to all of the residents of the region. So everyone is represented in equal measure on both entities as these decisions are made that affect their lives. At the same time, it recognizes, of course, that this is a government that delivers services, transit, sewer, housing, authority over land use and economic development, and more, and appropriates with no scrutiny or oversight under the present composition over the power of property taxation and over the appropriation of the significant dollars that they receive, both from the legislature and from the federal government, requiring, as foundational to our system of government, direct representation by the people of this region. So I don't view it as a concession or a compromise. I view it as the pulling together of two very powerful ideas to get out of this regional government what we say we all want. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Pratt, for presenting your ideas and sharing sort of the roots of your design. The couple things I wanted to share. One is I do disagree with the characterization that our region and Portland's region are so unique. Even in Denver, there's the Regional Transportation Board that is elected. And additionally, the scope of our Met Council is different from the similar bodies, one might say similar bodies in other regions, having power over transit and wastewater. So I want to highlight those pretty big differences and get on the record that, in fact, there are elected bodies across the nation who are working in regional governance. If we summarize the two leading proposals from this group in a very rudimentary way as one is a COG and one is a directly elected Met Council, I can see how Senator Dibble's proposal accommodates and tries to compromise in the direction of a COG. Sets up a bicameral body, one of those is a COG. That body has huge powers that I actually think might be too big, but I'm interested in talking about them, so I'm sort of demonstrating some trust. Could you help me see the compromise in your proposal towards the folks who are really interested in elected Met Council?
Senator Pratt, and then we'll have Ms. Pereira-Webb.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Green. In the two proposals, I haven't quite moved to any direct election. What I would say is that I think it's interesting to have a regional transit board. I have a proposal that suggests the legislature look at separating transit operations from the Metropolitan Council, and we can certainly discuss what that looks like. The reason I haven't is because what I've heard over and over again is we want this accountability. One of the concerns I have with Senator Dibble's bicameral proposal goes directly to what Mr. Rockwell said, is clarity of accountability. If you have two bodies making decisions, then who's accountable for the decision that's made? I'm concerned with some of the details in Senator Dibble's proposal.
Could we stay actually on the topic of your proposal? Because I'm interested in
Sure.
hearing you reflect on yours.
Well, and I think they go part and parcel, but when we have, so let's talk about a direct elect. And so certainly, I think we can say they're accountable to the residents that elect them, but they're not accountable to the governments that they're impacting, to to those entities that are tasked with implementing their directives. Okay, so.
Thank you. I think I'm going to sort of defer to the chair.
Commissioner Green, please go through the chair.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Beg your pardon.
Question to,
Well, I was just going to suggest that we could defer the conversation back to the chair, because my question is, what are the compromises in these proposals? And it sounds respectfully as if there aren't any, which is fine, that's the prerogative, but that's the question I was asking. And I would say that, I will also just want to say into the tape that not only do I not see the compromise towards sort of a nod towards a directly elected Met Council, but given the number of appointments and how they're allocated, there's so much power in the cities and townships, and such reduced power for counties, that I have significant problems with it. But as I've said consistently in this setting, I'm really interested in talking about proposals that get to this middle ground. So,
Okay.
thank you.
we're going to have 3 more comments, and then we'll move on. First, Ms. Pereira-Webb, then Commissioner Bingham, and then Chair Cleavorn.
Thank you, Chair Hornstein. I just want to go on the record that the unions have met, and there is no support for a council of governments from any of the unions at the Met Council currently. We have a huge issue with the cost. We are having trouble, not that anyone is overly ecstatic with the current council, because frankly, we know there's issues, and we're having trouble getting even to the table to talk about livable wages. So, of course, the members are worried, and we all sat and talked last night, we're worried about the cost of everything that we're talking about in this room, and that's one of the things that I think only Ms. Beckman's proposal that came out actually talked about, have we looked at the cost? I believe that the members of the council need to be better compensated so that we can maybe hold them accountable. They can have some staff if we can get them on board, because we're having a hard time staffing because of the issues that we're having. But we hope that that might hold them accountable. So the one thing that they are truly against is the Council of Governments, and it's just because of what they're seeing happening at the respective places currently for the members. And also for Senator Dibble, one of the things that they had some concerns over is major policy and who would control the final decisions that were made in terms of contracts, ratifications, and MOUs with the unions. And that could be, that's very gray in your proposal, so that would be one thing that we would ask, is that if you could take a look at that and we would like that the Regional Civic Council have full control over those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, and Commissioner Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on the topic of compromise, perhaps I might have been a little bit too vague or pitting the two against each other. The compromise was in a totality of the discussion. So I would say that Senator Dibble absolutely 100% compromised by bringing in a COG. He also absolutely 100% compromised on adding more of the governor's voice and the legislature's voice into his. Senator Pratt absolutely brought more of the city's approach and the governor's voice to the table. So I meant compromise as a totality. So I'm sorry, I probably was vague when I was using the word compromise. I'm passionate about bringing both of these forward because I believe it reflects the discussion and a majority of the opinions here of what has been going on. So that is why I just think, I'm going to say it one last time, I think it's a disservice to just say we're throwing everything in and moving it forward. I think it would be really wise for us to have Senator Dibble and Senator Pratt both moving forward so that then our friends at the legislature can continue to eloquently, and I'm going to watch because I'm going to love this debate, watching both of my friends here have this debate, and my friends in the other body have the discussion as well. But I think we need to have a clear, these two proposals had vigorous discussion. While they didn't have unanimity, didn't have a majority consensus on both. I think these two were the ones that at least gave and reflected the principles, reflected the vast majority of the discussion of this task force. That is all simply I'm asking, because I know I don't, that is what I'm asking, to give the legislature and the governor some direction.
Cleavorn, Chair Cleavorn, Mayor Hovland, and Ms. Paddock, and then we'll move on.
I'll try to keep my comments brief. I know people hate hearing a legislator say that. So I thought to myself this weekend, there is a whole lot of ignorance that I have on how we got to the conversation at this table today. And Ms. Paddock, I will want you to know 100 times over that I have heard your frustration and your concerns for your community. You know, as I have been looking at this, I went back and just did hours and hours of reading about how we got to where we were on the Southwest Light Rail Corridor, because I think a lot of the problems that we've been discussing here have to do with that. And I don't want to diminish the concerns that we heard at Lake Elmo or in Savage about local control and density and housing. But Southwest Light Rail has driven so much of this conversation. And if we ignore how the decisions were made in Southwest Light Rail and lay it solely at the feet of the Met Council, we're not talking about the process by which things have gotten done. And I do think the conversation is not wholly around governance, but it is also about process. And in the process of getting to the decisions, now keep in mind, I just had memorandums of understanding to read, newspaper articles to read, and limited by Google on the weekend, right? So there was great collaboration between Met Council, ACOG, and elected officials in making the decision to go forward. There were decisions that were made earlier that drove the corridor decision that that elected officials were involved in. There were decisions that were made as to not pursue other routes, right? To not even investigate them. So the question that I always go back to in this conversation, and to Commissioner Bigham's idea that we should just consider these two and put them together, we have to look at the structure that is currently in place and identify clearly the problems with that structure. To the idea of cost, in none of these proposals going forward have we discussed what it's going to cost, both the opportunity cost and the actual cost. What is it going to do to the employees that are currently there? None of these proposals truly outline who gets responsibility for what, and none of these proposals truly address the fact that the Met Council does a lot of really good work and successful work in other areas in addition to the good work that they are currently doing in transit. There is a huge idea of holding Met Council accountable for Southwest Light Rail that I hear loudly in this room. But I think that's what's driving this conversation.
I'll just add here, I think we have Mayor Hovland and Ms. Paddock still on the list, but I'll just say, Chair Cleveland, I understand where you're coming from. However, the idea of reforming Met Council governance and structure predates the problems with Southwest. And, I know that one of the first bills I introduced in 2003 here, well, I didn't, but I gave the idea to someone else who was in the majority. I realized at that point you should have a majority author, and at that time it was the GOP. And so in that case, that individual carried an elected Met Council bill that I had helped develop, and I've done that a number of times. I've done some COG bills also many years ago. Senator Pratt's done them. So I just, would say that even though that's a high-profile issue that the public is aware of, I think that we're here, because there is interest in the legislature in talking about Met Council governance.
And if I can just follow up with that, and I realize that as well in reading all of the articles that came out prior to this task force, right? There has been a 20-year initiative to do it, but in this work of this task force, just because people would like to see a different structure doesn't necessarily translate to the fact that the current structure is wholly broken, right? So, and even with the land use discussions we've had, just because you disagree with the outcome of the decision doesn't mean the process was broken. So I honor and respect
hear
that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, and we'll hear from Mayor Hovland, Ms. Paddock, and then we'll move on. Mayor Hovland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I lost my connection there and I had to reset everything here, so my apologies. I happened to run into, we had the U.S. Conference of Mayors winter meeting last week in Washington, D.C., and I happened to run into Charles Hales. You all remember the former mayor of Portland that I had testify, and also along with Michael Hancock, the now former mayor of Denver. And Charlie Hales said to me, you know, you guys have got, because I've been involved in this over the years and still work for a large infrastructure engineering company, you got a good model, just refine what you have. That was his comment, and I just offer that up for thought here. As to Commissioner Bingham's notion, a true compromise would involve some recognition of the existing model to the point that Representative Cleaborn is making. The model has been approved by the federal government. It is a legal model. I would argue with Professor Orfield about that. There has been significant criticism around transit. I'd say that's the most significant sort of criticism we've had as a Met Council. But when I asked Commissioner Bingham several weeks ago, tell me one way your county's been disadvantaged by the existing model, I haven't heard back as to what that was or how counties have been disadvantaged or cities have been disadvantaged, for that matter, by the existing model that we have. So I've tended, as we've listened to this conversation, to start liking the idea of Ms. Beckman. And I think we've got to remember that we had a Governor Dayton who vetoed, maybe it was your bill, Senator Dibble, some time ago. I don't mean to jump to conclusions as to whose bill that was on Met Council so-called reform, but we had a governor there that liked the model that we have and vetoed it. I hear now in Ms. Beckman's recommendation an inherent sort of belief that the governor is willing to listen to all these different ideas, but he wants the legislature to kind of vet these ideas. So while I like the idea of making incremental, slow improvements on our existing model, I do recognize that a broader conversation is probably due, and I think the governor would appreciate that broader conversation at the legislature about all these different recommendations that have been advanced and these variations on theme as between Senator Dibble and Commissioner Green on direct electeds, separating transit from policy from operations. All these different ideas need some more thorough vetting. I also agree with Representative Cleaborn that we have not done what we were supposed to do with respect to risk-benefit analysis or the in-depth analysis of the costing of each model. So I think that this is another reason to send it to the legislature as is and let them work through all these different ideas and see where they lead. Thank you.
We're going to hear from, I think, Ms. Paddock, Representative Weens, and then closing comments from Senator Pratt, and that is it. And then we're going to move to the Beckman motion. Ms. Paddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do think that we have identified a problem. We can at least go to the legislature with that. We have said that it's accountability. And I don't see, I mean, we've heard that from all over. It's not just the people in Southwest. We heard the people from White Bear Lake. We heard the people from North Minneapolis, everybody, and not just residents. We heard county board members. We heard city officials, township officials, and they were all saying there's a problem. And I think it's good that we have at least agreed with that and can report to the legislature. If our goal is to make some recommendations, I mean, nobody said we had to come up with solutions. We had to come up with ideas. I don't see anything wrong with forwarding the two ideas that Ms. Beckman has recommended, but also include the direct elect model. So we would recommend 3. as models that we talked about and that we considered, because that's the truth. It is what we discussed here, and we don't have to recommend any of them. We can say, these are 3 directions you can go. This is as far as we got in working out how they might look.
Thank you. And then finally, Representative Weens and Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to move to speak based on Mayor Hovland's statement about really communities being adversely affected. That's an imperfect translation, but from our public engagement session in Lake Elmo, I think what you heard wasn't so much about transportation, but it was about development and the forcing mechanism that the Met Council used to make small communities grow into a smart community. We also heard there some concerns about other communities fearing that they would be forced to develop in a way that doesn't fit their particular culture or desire, and that they would be considered a land bank. In that, I think I've been pretty pernicious on each, whether it was Denver or Portland, and even an exchange with Senator Dibble last week on his proposal about how can communities, if they don't want to be this part of the comp plan, how they can opt out. It's concerning to me that we examine the problem, and we've talked about accountability, and we've gone through our principles. And I think the best way forward is to take what I would consider the hybrid and the COG model. And for my communities, that gives them the best chance to have their voice heard, whether it's a combination of a direct elect and a COG, that their voice is heard so that they can choose their own future. So in support, I'm in support of that motion to have those two major.
We'll get to that.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to kind of clarify, I've created kind of a comparison sheet. And admittedly, this is my take on the pros and the cons of each model. And while as I stated, I still prefer the first proposal, which is not a true COG, but a modified COG. I've also tried to accommodate the concerns that I've heard from Mayor Hovland and Chair Cleavorn and others, while still maintaining the principle that we voted on to be locally selected. You know, one of the issues that I've had for a long time is we have one nominating committee for all the districts. And I may or may not, my communities may or may not have a voice in that nominating committee. And the governor can reject those recommendations and pick somebody else, which again leads to the perception of partisanship. So what I've tried to do is compromise maybe more closely with the concerns of Chair Cleavorn and Mayor Hovland than trying to figure out how to fit in a direct elect, because I still have significant concerns, and we'll be doing that vetting through the legislative process. I assume that Senator Dibble and I will have many conversations on this topic going forward. But it's also an idea to say that, as I mentioned, this was one idea for a compromise, and there are many ideas, many that we haven't thought of yet for areas of compromise. And that's how Proposal 1 and Proposal 2 kind of work together. There is an attempt to compromise, there is an attempt to move, even though I still have strong feelings on the first proposal. So, Mr. Chair, I would close with that, and thank you for the time to talk about both of the proposals that were submitted.
Thank you so much, Senator Pratt. We are now going to move to a proposal from Ms. Beckman and discuss that. And I also think that there's a motion from, after that, there'll be a motion from Commissioner Bingham. So, Ms. Beckman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I said it before. I feel like we've done really good work, and I think the legislature really wanted us to do the 6-month due diligence that we did and bring out this issue and bring forward ideas, and that the compressed time of the legislature and all the issues that you guys deal with when you are there, that you wouldn't have the time to go dive deep the way we have done. And so I think we've done good work. There have been seismic shifts, as you've pointed out, and I think that the compromise and the proposals are richer for the due diligence that we've done, but we're not done with it. And so I'd like to send all of them to the legislature for consideration without there being a majority report saying we picked this one over all of them. So that's my motion.
Discussion? Chair Cleavorn.
I just have a point of clarification.
Yeah.
So you, in your motion, you are also including Mayor Hovland's proposal as amended today. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair and Chair Cleavorn, I think what I said in the motion is any proposal that was submitted by January 24th just goes into the report. And so Taylor and staff would just layer them all in there and they'd all be sent.
Thank you very much for the clarification.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if this motion were to prevail, I just want to remind folks that I would make some little tweaks to what is before you, which I mentioned in my description. I made a few mistakes, and I do want to also mention the importance of redistricting. I also want to make one other change that I want to mention now. We call the local government, we have the Regional Civic Council and the Local Government Council. And there seems to be persistence of confusion about, and a binary discussion that this is elected versus COG. This is elected and COG. So I will resubmit the document to the staff, changing the name of the Local Government Council to the Council of Governments.
Okay. So with that, that's important, and we'll note that for the record. Any other discussion? Representative Cosnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members or task force members. Just for the record, I guess, since we're not taking actual votes on some of these proposals specifically, it's my perception that this task force was originated due to having bipartisan, bicameral opposition to an elected Met Council. That this task force was designed to kind of see if we can muster up enough support, put a lot of Minneapolis people on this task force, and just kind of send it to the legislature that we should have an elected Met Council. This task force studied it for 6 months. Here you go. This is what we're going to try to ram through, is my perception. I think it's important to note for the public that's watching that an elected Met Council does not have the support here in this task force, and we're not taking a vote on that, says a lot. So I appreciate the accommodations, if you don't want to call them compromises, in Senator Dibble's new proposal. But having an elected Met Council and then a Council of Governance, adding another layer of bureaucracy, I think we should note that it creates more bureaucracy, but it's less transparent and less accountable, and that's really why we're here discussing the reforms of the Met Council, to make it more transparent and more accountable, not less. And so I appreciate the compromise, but I think it's just more of a convoluted cluster. And we won't be taking a vote, that doesn't seem like, on the particular options, but I want it to be, at least on the video record, that some of those objectives are noted.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
I cannot leave that statement hanging without a rebuttal.
Please.
My proposal achieves the exact opposite of what Representative Cosnick is describing. It creates way more sunshine and takes the power out of the hands of an unelected and opaque bureaucracy and puts it squarely in the public sector, in the public square, for open discussion and debate, whether that's through direct election of elected officials on the civic council or through the highly valued collaboration that's driven through the power that's given to locally elected officials. It does not create more bureaucracy. It brings those discussions out into the open for an open, transparent, accountable decision-making process.
Professor Orfin.
I think that we've known since the inception of the Metropolitan Council that the public wants it to be elected. Every poll that's ever been taken has been overwhelming that the public believes it should be elected. It is the largest local unit of government in the state. It says it's a local government. It is the largest. It has broad discretion. It has enormous taxing power. In America, from the founding, it is our tradition that bodies with broad, powerful discretion and taxing power be elected. It's our tradition, it's our law. And that we have the largest local unit of government in the state that makes the most important decisions about how the metropolitan area goes forward, that the public has, from its inception, wanted it to be elected. I think it's a scandal that we can't consider the special interests, when they move to accept all options, mean no progress, mean that we will continue to accept an appointed, hyper-captured, huge entity that doesn't represent the public, that doesn't listen to the public, that doesn't respond to the public, that taxes the public, that shapes the public's environment. We're saying it shouldn't be elected even though the public has long said so.
Thank you. And if members could confine their comments to the motion. I think we have Mayor Hovland. And briefly confine.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think our work over the past 6 months and the conversation over the past few weeks has let all of us think about and understand that there are different models for how all voices are heard and all residents are represented. So I felt like I didn't do a good job of, I caused some angst for Senator Dibble when I was giving a comparative model of what we have now by statute at the tab and how cities of the first class are represented and in our discussion about proportionality. So, and I think my vote reflected, I thought appropriately that all voices needed to be heard and all voices should be equally represented. And that was just the purpose of my final comment here, Mr. Chair. And I do favor the Beckman motion to send all recommendations made to the task force by the end of business today to the legislature for consideration.
Okay, thank you. Senator Pratt, and then we'll close this, and I think there might be an amendment here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and just in response to Professor Orfield's comments, when we talk about polling, it's always been a binary poll. Should the Met Council be appointed or should it be elected? And there's never been any real conversation about another option. I think back to something that we heard during the Metro Portland conversation. They chose a elected model out of frustration of their current model. That's exactly what she said. There were no other options. There was no discussion like we're having here today around that. Should the Met Council have taxing authority? I don't know. Do our locally elected officials have the credibility and the authority to do the taxing if the legislature so decides that they should have that? I think they do, but we should have that discussion. When we talk about the virtues that are conferred upon someone who's elected, I saw those same virtues in a locally elected official as I did from a Met Council election. And yet, we've glossed over some of the problems that come with direct election. Our school board and city council elections, which are supposed to be nonpartisan, are highly partisan today. We have local units of government parties recommending, endorsing candidates. We've seen from the campaign finance reports out of Metro Portland special interest money is flowing in to make sure that their candidate gets elected and will support whether it's garbage or development or, you know, you name whatever's in front of the council, and out-of-state money is flowing in. Is that really what we want from a regional government? That's not what I want. That's not what my communities want. And that's the concern I have as we move forward. And so we can talk about the democracy, but we already have the democracy. These locally elected officials are already being elected by residents to represent their interests, all interests of the cities, all interests of the counties. And as representatives, they're not just sitting at their own board table representing their needs, but they're going to national conferences, they're going to TABs and other commissions. My county commissioners serve on dozens of different commissions. My city council members serve on different boards and commissions locally. Are we saying that all of those need to be directly elected because that's what democracy is? No, democracy is we're electing representatives to stand for, to advocate for their constituencies. So I think, you know, Representative Kosnick was onto something here in that, and I just needed to add on to Professor Orfield's comments because I think it left out some of the problems that we've seen in that model and why, as I've tried to compromise, I haven't quite gotten to the idea of direct election.
Thank you. Commissioner Bingham.
Mr. Chair, would this be the moment where I amend Ms. Beckman's amendment?
Yeah, you.
I move
can do
to amend Ms. Beckman's amendment to include both Senator Dibble and Senator Pratt's first proposal for COG for recommendation in the legislative report to the legislature.
that. Discussion?
To the motion, can I speak to my own motion first?
Yes.
So, Mr. Chair, I believe that I've said a lot and spoke throughout the morning on this, but I believe that we need to have clearer direction than just throwing everything in a stew and letting it stew and saying, here, you choose, legislature, and leaving it up to government relations teams, essentially, to figure this out from you know, working the legislature and seeing who can get the votes to do their thing. And this truly is a work of how collectively we want to have our region have the accountability and the responsibility to these projects, to these services, and to our people. These two proposals, not perfect, reflect those principles, and I believe that the 201 legislators plus the governor are fully capable in hashing out those details. But with these concepts, at least give them some direction of our conversation that we had, and they reflect all of that. So I'm asking to give a little bit more clarity, a little bit more direction to them, so that we don't end up with the status quo, which I don't believe any of us want. And so I'm just asking to at least let's put a little bit more definition in Ms. Beckman's motion, knowing that none of these are perfect and that they're going to have to figure this out in the legislature.
Thank you.
Point of clarification. Is this motion an amendment or is it a replacement motion?
It's I think it's written to the Beckman motion. Chair Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the conversation. And with all due respect, as an elected suburban legislator whose mayors and city council members came and testified in great detail in opposition, I think I would not be holding my responsibility and my obligation if I only said, if I vote in favor of your motion. All proposals, including those that this task force, because we haven't reached consensus, all proposals should go forward, not just two. So it's either all proposals go forward in my mind, or no proposals go forward. We have to make sure that every voice at this table is heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion of the Bingham motion?
Yes, Mr.
Mayor
Chair.
Hovland.
Thank you. I'll lower my hand here. I think this is unnecessary because my understanding of the Beckman motion is that all recommendations made by, and I say, emphasize the word all recommendations made to the task force by the end of business today, January 24th, 2022, are going to be included. So what I think Commissioner Bingham is concerned about is those recommendations be in there, would be in there because those submissions have already been made. So I think her amendment or her friendly amendment is unnecessary due to the expansive nature of Member Beckman's motion.
Commissioner Bingham, I think, would like to clarify.
No, Mr. Chair, Mayor Hovland, these would be the only two moving forward.
Okay, Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Bingham, for bringing this forward. I do oppose this motion. As was said earlier in this group doesn't support direct election, but this group also doesn't support a COG. And I see this motion as an effort by a small number of COG proponents to try to keep an elected Met Council, the idea of an elected Met Council, out of the report. Further, was strong support for a directly elected Met Council as voiced by the public in our listening sessions and has been voiced in this room. And it would be a disservice to both those voices and those in this room if this were to pass and that proposal was not included in the package that we send on.
Mayor Hovland.
Mr. Chair, you cannot stand for the proposition, the fundamental of democracy, that all voices should be heard and all voices matter, and then just advance a portion of what's been recommended out of this task force. I think Member Beckman is on the right track here. Let's advance everything so that the legislature clearly understands the breadth and scope of our work and has in front of them the different models that allow all voices to be heard and make sure that all voices matter and that all residents are effectively represented.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I ask a clarifying question? So the report would say these were the two that got the most discussion, let's say the most support, but every proposal would be included in the report documentation along with all the documentation that we've had along the way. Is that correct?
I'll defer to our staff member, Ms. Kohler.
Yes, we could certainly put the two proposals in the main part of the report, but everything would be appendixed. And I could certainly mention the other proposals are in the appendix, and these were things also discussed. Additionally, the report does include all of our meetings and would cover the subjects that were discussed in the meeting, so that information is there as well.
But the recommendation would be, so the Beckman motion is to recommend all items that were submitted, and the Bingham motion is to just recommend these two as recommendations. Obviously, there would be an appendix, et cetera. So I just want to be clear on this, that the Beckman motion advances as a recommendation all, and Bingham is advancing as a recommendation just these two.
Mr. Chair, point of clarification, the remarks that were just shared by Ms. Keller, could you clarify, that was a description of what would happen if the Bingham motion advanced?
Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
If we have no other discussion, we'll have Representative Koznick, and then we'll have the maker of the motion,
Just a question to Ms. Beckman or
the original motion. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Is it in here, and I did read it previously, but now I'm trying to fast read it again. Does it state that there is no consensus? Because I think if we're sending 2 or 3 or 5 or all recommendations. It should say as a public document that there is no recommendation that has consensus out of this task force. And I think that would be important. If it's not in there, Ms. Beckman, maybe staff could help us add that as a friendly amendment.
Mr. Chair, I don't accept that as a friendly amendment. I think the whole point is we haven't talked about any of these enough. We haven't had enough testimony. As a former deputy mayor, I care deeply about what cities think, and I'd really love to have a conversation about each one of these proposals and have metro cities and the city of St. Paul come in and say, we like that, we don't like that. And it is the absence of that process, the absence of, those conversations that just make me want to send all of them and let the legislature pull bills and have those conversations there. So I'm not saying there isn't a consensus. I'm not saying there is a consensus. I think you have overstepped a little bit and said that there's an absence of support for elected, because again, we just haven't had the conversation. And so I thank you, but I'm going to decline your amendment, and I also decline Commissioner Bigham's. I appreciate how much we have talked going into this, but I can't lift up 2 out of all of this, because those 2, while we've batted them around a lot more than others, it doesn't mean that we should dismiss other conversations here. I also want to be a little more clear. The proposals I'm suggesting advance are the actual governance proposals, the things like recommendations on vision and others. I think maybe those go in the addendum, but for me it is the Green, Dibble, Hovland, both of Senator Pratt's, and I think those are all the actual. Do you consider yours a governance motion or just a recommendation? I'm looking at Sam, yeah.
I would consider mine linked with the principle of accountability. We can talk about it in a minute. But,
Got it.
yeah.
Okay.
And Ms. Paddock had one. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I'll leave the last word to the maker of the amendment.
Mr. Chair, I had asked the question and kind of had the floor. I wanted just a closing comment. I do agree with Ms. Beckman, and no fault of the committee or the chair, but we were on a very compressed process and time constraints trying to meet and be done before the legislature meets. But that in itself is why I have concerns that this task force is saying we're going to make a recommendation and here's 2 ideas. But because there is no consensus and we haven't done what was statutorily recommended to do the cost analysis and that, and maybe one of the recommendations could be that, we continue to work beyond that. Not that none of us have put in enough time already, but without or acknowledging, as you have stated, the process and time constraints, I'm not comfortable making any recommendations out of this task force absent consensus on any of those proposals, which I don't believe we have.
Mr. Chair, and I guess to Ms. Beckman's point, then I don't see honestly how we can have any recommendation. And to Representative Koznick's point, because if you feel that we haven't had enough discussion about all of these, then maybe it should be no recommendation of any of them, because, and this task force hasn't done what it was supposed to do. And again, that just means that the status quo is going to go forward, and it's going to just perpetuate the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, of representation of a region that is entitled to billions of dollars of federal money, of water, of transit, that my colleague sitting across from me just had to vote for $100 million with $90 million more to go on a project that has been almost $300 billion due to inefficiencies and ineffectiveness of this governance council. So maybe the task force does need to continue to meet then.
I will just respond to that and say, I disagree, Commissioner Bingham. I mean, we have had some really new creative ideas emerge from this task force, things that have not been in any report up till now. We have had robust discussion. We have heard from people around the country. We have had 4 very well-attended public meetings. I can't think of any other time in my legislative career where there has been such a focus on metropolitan governance. We have heard from counties. We have previous proposals that have been refined. We have a very new innovative proposal from Senator Dibble. I do want to honor the work that Mayor Hovland has done. I want to honor the perspective of Chair Cleavorn, who has also raised issues around the existing work that's already been done, on this issue and in terms of governance. And so I think that the Beckman motion does capture, I think, the extent of a lot of work here. Obviously, it's incomplete. Yes, there is a compressed timeline. But to simply say that we haven't done our due diligence, I think the opposite is true. We have new and innovative ideas. We have existing ideas that all, I think, the legislature would benefit from. In the first ever report, I think, that has included both a refined version of a COG and elected Met Council, along with Representative Kosnick and Mayor Hovland's ideas. So I do support the original motion. I appreciate your motion as well, at least highlighting the 2 ideas that we've spent some time on. So I just wanted to just give some perspective on that because, this commission, this task force has done quite a bit of groundbreaking work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's just a quick question then, maybe on process. So presuming the Bingham Amendment fails or motion, and what would be the outcome? What would be the difference if we adopted Ms. Beckman's motion or we rejected it? Wouldn't it have the same impact? That all proposals then would be documented within the report and sent to the legislature?
My understanding, and if others have perspective, we would be your proposal and Senator Dibble's would also be forwarded along with these other recommendations.
So, Mr. Chair, again, the question, if I'm trying to understand the impact that Ms. Beckman's motion has, because it seems to me that whether we pass it or not, or whether we pass, if Commissioner Bingham's motion fails, I'm trying to understand what the difference between Ms. Beckman's motion is if it passes or fails to the final report, because it seems to me that if we are silent on any recommendation, then all proposals would be forwarded to the legislature, just as you stated. And that's why I'm trying to understand, what does the motion do above and beyond what would happen if there were no motion?
I could defer to Ms. Beckman, but I think it does, it would, I think, summarize the body of work that we have done and honor the proposals that were discussed here. But Ms. Beckman.
No, Mr. Chair, that you hit the nail on the head.
Further discussion?
Sure.
One more, I'll let you speak one more time, Mayor Hovland, but then we're going to have to move on.
Thank you. Yeah, this is just to reinforce, I think, what you said. I thought you handled it really well. To me, it's not that we're sending things forward with no recommendation. We are recommending all of these motions or models be considered by the legislature as the work product of the task force. So I think it is going forward, and I concur with you that we are making a recommendation here, and that is that all of these models be considered, all these motions be considered by the legislature. So I think that is a nice body of work to be sending to them. And I thank you for your work and everybody else's work.
Professor Orfield.
I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, if we could amend this motion so that we can we can vote on each proposal. We will accept the governor's recommendation that we want to send them all forward, but maybe we could each vote on each of these just to give them a sense of our consensus on this, so that instead of having this commission meet for so long and have no particular recommendation.
Ms. Beckman.
Mr. Chair and Professor Orfield, I want to be clear, this is the Beckman motion, and it is not the governor's recommendation. My intent on this is we have a menu of ideas, and I'd like the menu to be 6 ideas rather than 2. And I think that all of the ideas have merit, and they all need work, and the legislature should see them as equally weighted as here's ideas that percolated up and we worked on them and take these forward. And let's be honest, we know that in the legislative process, we could put forward a report that just has these 2, and a legislator could pick up Chair Green's or Commissioner Green's proposal and put in a bill. I mean, there is nothing binding about what we're doing. There is nothing, it just says, we have looked at these, we've done due diligence, we've spent time, here are all the ideas that came up, and the legislature should consider them equally as they move forward.
Thank you. Okay, with that, Commissioner Bingham, any last words? So we're going to vote on the Bingham motion. We'll read the motion so everyone is clear on what we're voting for. Voting on.
Okay. Am I okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner Bingham. The motion that I have, or essentially amendment to Ms. Beckman's, is to move to include only Senator Dibble's COG proposal and Senator Dibble's hybrid proposal and Senator Pratt's COG proposal for recommendations in the legislative report. Number one. The non-governor appointed one, correct?
No, it's the governor.
The governor appointed one?
It's the first one.
Okay.
Okay. We're clear.
Chair Hornstein.
No.
Senator Pratt.
Yes.
Ms. Beckman.
No.
Commissioner Bingham.
Yes.
Senator Coleman.
Yes.
Senator Dibble.
No.
Commissioner Green.
No.
Mayor Hovland.
No.
Representative Claiborne.
No.
Representative Koznick.
Yes.
Professor Orfield.
No.
Ms. Paddock.
No.
Ms. Pereira-Webb.
No.
Senator Port.
No.
Mr. Reed.
Yes.
Mr. Rockwell.
No.
Representative Weens.
Yes.
6 yes, 11 no. 6 yes, 11 no.
6 ayes, 11 noes, the motion does not prevail. And now we're on to the main Beckman motion. Any further discussion? You don't? Okay. And I think everyone has the text in front of them, so we don't need to read that. Okay, Ms. Olson.
Chair Horns.
Oh, Mr. Rockwell.
Are we voting on this? We didn't vote on any of the others in today. We're voting on the
Beckman motion.
Okay, so we are voting on the Beckman motion, even though
Correct.
we did not vote on any of the other proposals.
No, we're voting on the Beckman motion now.
Got it, okay.
Okay. Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Ms. Beckman.
Aye.
Commissioner Bingham. Senator Coleman.
Aye.
Senator Dibble.
Yes.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Claiborne.
Aye.
Representative Koznick.
No.
Professor Orfield.
Pass.
Ms. Paddock?
Aye.
Ms. Pereira-Webb?
Aye.
Senator Port?
Aye.
Mr. Reed? Mr. Rockwell?
No.
Representative Weens?
Aye.
Professor Orfield?
No.
3 no, 14 yes.
There being 14 ayes and 3 noes, the motion prevails. Okay, members, now that we have dealt with some of these governance issues, there are a few other items before us and motions. So we will start with Senator Pratt. And I think you have a motion around separating Metro Transit from Met Council.
Yes, Mr. Chair. One of the things that we heard on numerous occasions in our public hearings was we needed to break apart Metro Transit from the Metropolitan Council. And it's interesting that we are, as we talk to other metropolitan areas, they have a monopoly on transit service. And I have yet to find one, I think, with the number of providers that we have here in the metro area, whether it's Plymouth Transit or Southwest Transit or Minnesota Valley. It's important to recognize that there is a perceived conflict of interest between the Metropolitan Council being the planning organization and the operator of Metro Transit. It's also, not lost on me that that's a very complicated proposal in and of itself. And Mr. Chair, this is me filibustering until I can actually find the text of my proposal. So, oh, there we go. Thank you. So it just recommends that the legislature work on legislation to create a working group of all of the stakeholders to recommend options on how to implement a separation of Metropolitan Council operations and planning. And so I think that goes to the concerns of the employees, that they have a voice in how that happens, that we decide how that separation occurs, and we continue to move forward with that part of the discussion, because it's so important that we continue to look at the scope of the Metropolitan Council and to make sure that we have a very distinct break between operations and planning.
Okay, discussion, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would support this motion if the word operations were struck from it. I do believe, with a great strength of feeling, that the Met Council has shown itself less than the ideal agency to do major construction. And we do have an agency, you and I have had this discussion, that does a great job of major public works construction. That's the Department of Transportation. And in fact, they built the Blue Line, and they did a really good job of the Blue Line, and then turned the facility over to the Met Council for operating purposes. I have not yet been persuaded that something magic would happen if the Met Council, as the entity that both plans and operates transit, were to have those functions separated. I've heard this said a lot, but I just haven't seen the evidence, and I actually think there's a lot of power in the idea of linking both. I also know that from what we see around the country, these MPOs, as the planning entities, often don't have the ability to compel the implementing agencies or entities to fulfill the plans. These become beautiful plans with lovely words that sit on shelves, and the agency that has the real power is the agency that actually puts the services on the ground. And they don't, I'm not suggesting that the Met Council lives up to its plans and its beautiful, poetic, epic prose that it writes into its plans, but the linkage is much there, and under a more robust model of governance and accountability, oversight, sunshine, all the things, we would see shared mutually with the COG and the elected body, as is in my proposal, we would see transit delivered in a way that fulfills policies and laws and the expectations of the public. So I'm not there. You would notice in my proposal that the evaluation piece is separated, and I think I heard a lot of discussion about that, and I'm persuaded that on the backside, holding the implementing agency to account by a separate entity, hopefully more objective, but certainly not invested in evaluating in a way that shines the best light on the delivery of services. I think that's an interesting and powerful idea. I don't support the proposal as is. I would support it if you took operations out and we invested constructing these facilities with another agency.
Ms. Pereira-Webb.
Thank you, Chair Hornstein. And since you mentioned employees, Senator Pratt, I just wanted to speak up and say that the employees do not support this motion, and so I would not be able to support it. There's numerous reasons, but it is not in support.
Commissioner Bingham.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dibble's been consistent in that opinion from when I carried this bill. Just wanted to put that on the record.
If you know anything about Senator Dibble, he's consistent. Okay, did you want to have a
Just a couple
comment?
of closing thoughts.
Sorry, excuse me. I didn't realize we have Professor Orfield and Mayor Hovland briefly.
I would oppose this idea. We used to have a separate transit board, and it didn't function very well. And other parts of the country, it depends on whether the MPO is supportive. And so if you have a good MPO, you have a good transit system. If you have a transit board and a bad MPO, it doesn't make any difference because the MPO has all the power. I think one of the things we did do in the reorganization is we stopped a lot of internecine warfare and complicated opposition that persisted for decades that prevented any real action on this with having a board that opposed to the Met Council. We also had sewer agency that was building sewers north and the freeways were going south. That was a bad issue. So having this together is good. We need a good MPO if we want a good transit system. If we don't have a good MPO, we won't have a good transit system.
Okay, Mayor Hovland, Ms. Paddock, and then we really got to cut it off. So, Mayor Hovland. Could you unmute?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I just caught that, that I was on mute. I would just encourage folks, and I'm sure many of you read the submission I made, but there's a history in there. Professor Orfield alluded to it, of us having a regional transit board. And if you recall, I've mentioned, I think at least once as a young lawyer in the 80s, I was on that board. And the troubles that we had in coordinating planning with operations from two separate entities it led to the demise of the Regional Transit Board and all of the functions of the Regional Transit Board being subsumed into the Met Council. And as a person who's been over there now for well over a decade, as I've mentioned previously, I see that there's value in having operations and planning in the same, involved in the same entity as the MPO, as Professor Orfield states. So I don't support separating these two. I think we tried it in the past. It was a failure. We shouldn't do it. We shouldn't plow that old ground. Also, we don't even know about the cost analysis on it. So I just think it's premature. It's not a good idea.
Then I think we had Ms. Paddock, and then we'll have concluding comments from the author.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak in favor of this motion. I did submit a proposal a long time ago at the very beginning, which did not receive very much discussion, but it did incorporate a separate transit organization that would receive funding from the Met Council and would then implement the big picture Met Council planning as it related to transportation or transit. And because it was, it received funding from the Met Council, it would therefore, in effect, be evaluated by the Met Council. I'm very concerned that there be some kind of mechanism by which our transit authority has some oversight, and I think that would be possible under this proposal.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would maybe agree with Mayor Hovland if we had one transit provider. We don't. We have one transit provider that's embedded within the Metropolitan Planning Organization that's regionally responsible, and that transit operator has an unfair advantage over the other providers. I'm actually pleased that we have multiple providers. And this doesn't say that we create a new regional transit board. This says to the legislature, let's take a look at how that separation can be. And Senator Dibble, I'm noticing the typos. It should say operations and construction, and take out the depending on what you decide. I started to do that in the notes. But we want all our transit providers to be on equal footing. I did talk to one of the authors that moved Metro Transit under the Metropolitan Council, and he said very much what Professor Orfield said, that it was an ineffective board, to use his words, corrupt, and they didn't know what else to do with it, so they stuck it in Met Council. We also ended up with suburban transit providers because Metro Transit was not providing services to the areas that now have suburban transit authorities. And we're very happy with our providers. We're not going to Metropolitan Council. Shouldn't all our transit providers be on equal footing? If we don't separate the operations from Metropolitan Council and let Met Council really focus on the strategy, the vision, the planning of the region. If they're bogged down with the operations of when is the 496 bus going to hit the Burnsville Transit Station, they've lost their focus. And so, members, I encourage you to vote on this. This is not establishing a metro. This is just telling the legislature they need to take a look at that separation.
Okay, I see no further comments. Ms. Olson?
Chair Hornstein?
No.
Senator Pratt?
Yes.
Ms. Beckman?
No.
Commissioner Bigham?
Yes.
Senator Coleman?
Yes.
Senator Dibble?
No.
Commissioner Green?
No.
Mayor Hovland?
No.
Representative Cleaborn?
No.
Representative Koznick?
Yes.
Professor Orfield?
No.
Ms. Paddock?
Yes.
Ms. Pereira-Webb?
No.
Senator Port?
No.
Mr. Reed?
Yes.
Mr. Rockwell?
No.
Representative Weens?
Yes.
7 yes, 10 no.
7 ayes, 10 nays, the motion does not prevail. Next, Mr. Rockwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I see there's some overlap here with Ms. Paddock's motion coming up as well. This motion is to establish a set of comprehensive statutory goals for the Metropolitan Council and articulates that these goals can.
Excuse me, Mr. Rockwell.
Yeah.
There is one more governance-related one, and we're going to take yours and Ms. Paddock's together.
All right, very good.
Division. So
Yeah.
let's do Commissioner Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's actually a couple. Real quick, the first one that I have is there was a lot of discussion about HRA and housing vouchers. And so obviously the counties have concerns about that, but we've no longer support taking over the vouchers because of other issues I won't get into right now, but because some of us use our own HRA, some use Metro HRA. But we all do want to have a discussion about the financing and funding of that. And I, regrettably, Senator Port and I were not able to connect to talk a little bit about this, but I just have a very simple motion that I would appreciate to be in consideration, which simply says, and I would move, that a reformed council, and by the way, if Senator Port wanted to take a look at this, even if nothing happens or this next session, that a reform council would need to immediately address the funding structure and relationship between the Metro HRA and other regional HRAs related to the administration of housing vouchers. So simply put, we just want that discussion to happen and start looking at that funding structure and relationship. So no specific description, no specific actions. We just want that discussion to start happening.
I know that Senator Port, the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Bingham, for bringing this. Obviously, this is a discussion that I've heard a lot about in the last few years, and I agree that there are challenges here that we need to discuss. I would support this motion.
Thank you.
Okay, I know, is Ms. Pereira Webb here? Okay, I would want to hear a little bit from her. I know that she's in this division. So hopefully she will return briefly. And yeah, maybe if we can just hold this and then, okay. We can hold on this and then we can do your second motion.
Okay. The second motion is that, the Blue Ribbon Panel report that we all discussed earlier on had a couple things in it, and one that stuck out to me, especially in light of the news and the action that had to be taken at Hennepin County this week related to Southwest Rail, and also some of the wonderful things that Gold Line BRT are doing in their operating offices related to transit projects. The Blue Ribbon Panel on page 10 does talk about some performance measures related to funding for transportation and transit projects. This was directly taken out of the county's recommendations that you have. But my motion would be to include what was on page 10 from the Blue Ribbon Panel from 2020 to develop, adopt, and articulate agreed-upon regional transit service efficiencies and allow for strong local input into decisions about investment and operations. So it's taking what was already decided in the Blue Ribbon Panel and putting it in this one as well.
Okay, discussion? This is not to the Metro HRA one. Okay, we'll take the roll on the second Bingham motion. Oh, were you?
Oh, just
Yeah.
got to give Commissioner Bingham a little love. It's a good motion. We should vote for it.
Yay!
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Ms. Beckman.
The second Bingham motion.
Aye. Commissioner Bingham.
Aye.
Senator Coleman.
Aye.
Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Claiborne.
Aye.
Representative Koznick.
Aye.
Professor Orfield.
Abstain.
Ms. Paddock.
Aye.
Ms. Pereira Webb.
Aye.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Aye. Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
16 aye, 1 abstention.
Let the record show.
16
Oh,
ayes,
my
1
God.
abstention, the motion prevails.
So, Mr. Chair, would you like to ask your question of Ms. Pereira?
Yeah, so Ms. Pereira Webb, there was a motion proposed by Commissioner Bingham related to Metro HRA, and I know that you have some expertise in this and just wanted to get your perspective. I think just if Commissioner
Mr. Chair,
Bingham
just
could
context is to
explain.
have that discussion
To have a
between-
discussion not a full-fledged
Yeah,
recommendation.
about the funding structure and relationship. There's no specific ask, no specific recommendations. It's just to start that discussion about it.
Yeah, and just to start the discussion is fine, because as Commissioner Bingham and I have talked earlier, there are entities that you have to talk to that aren't
HUD.
outside of this body that don't govern that, and many of the vouchers that have even been talked about in Scott County and all, we don't have purview over anyway. So if it's just to start some discussion about it, I won't.
Okay, good. I knew that you had expertise and wanted to make sure you were in the room when we discussed it. Okay, Commissioner Cleveland, or Chair Cleveland.
That's all right.
We're promoting you to County Commissioner.
Oh, no, I prefer to be right where I am. Thank you. So the word immediately address causes me some pause.
Okay.
But to say to discuss or review or to explore,
Pick one of them. Whatever you want to suggest, and then I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
yeah, I would say to review.
Okay, to review.
Ms. Pereira-Webb.
If I can just go back to Commissioner Bingham one more time. When you say between the Metro area and other regional HRAs, we know that we administer certain ones and everything else is a purview under HUD, and your directors and all, and many of you already do your own. So can you just give me a little more information on what you're saying here? It's a little different than what we talked about this morning.
Yep, no, so what, Mr. Chair, so what the idea is as there are certain large segments of the metro that use Metro HRA, and then there are other counties that have their own HRA. In fact, in some of those counties, there are HRAs that even go below that. So the idea is to have a discussion amongst all of the local HRAs, and as you astutely pointed out, HUD will have to be a discussion of that too, to talk about when there are overages, how to have those discussions about how the overages are implemented so that everybody is on the same page, and have that discussion going forward about that. Again, there's no specific changes requested or any sort of asks other than to have that discussion going forward.
And with that broad stroke, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Quick question from Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Bingham, as we've talked, you just mentioned it, some of the counties that have their own HRAs are contributing to the operations of the Metro HRA. And so this is really just to say that the cost will follow the services.
Correct.
And that's embedded within this motion, even though it's not specifically called out.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, yes, the discussion will formulate around what I just said, which is related to the financing and the overages and following the cost. The vouchers follow the cost of, of where the voucher is assigned. And so it all plays, and when you have all these different HRAs, and there just has to be a conversation about that. And so I think having that is an important discussion to have.
Any further discussion? Ms. Pereira-Webb.
Sorry, I know we're all on time, but I just gotta. So that plays back to, that was pretty much a very oversimplification of it. And overages, each HRA does their overages, and we work with that with HUD, and that's covered by HUD. I think you're more talking about some of the more taxes and those type of things that may be covering. So I just want to be clear on that. This isn't, there's no preview to where Metro HRA, if we go over anything, we go out to the other HR. For people that don't know, we don't go to the other HRAs and collect that money. That is then taken back to HUD, and HUD then makes each HRA or CDA in Dakota County's case whole. So I just want that to be clear.
So, Mr. Chair, the Met Council as a whole has a taxing, right? They tax all the metro area, and a portion of that is used to administer the vouchers. And there are some of us that have our own, but yet HRAs, but yet we contribute to the metro HRA. So that is essentially the discussion we want to have. Again, this motion does not ask a specific thing other than to start that discussion.
So just to read the, Professor Orford, really quick.
Really briefly, I think a comprehensive look needs to be looked at, all these questions. It seems like one small piece of the puzzle. I certainly would support a reform. But I'm just to think about this in isolation to the other parts of housing and the Met Council's operation, I'd like to have the housing issue addressed more comprehensively.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Orfield. I trust my friend and former colleague, Chair Port, to have that robust conversation.
And so again, the motion is that a reformed council would need to review the funding structure and relationship between Metro HRA and other regional HRAs related to administration of housing vouchers. Chair Cleavorn.
City of Plymouth has its own HRA. So if we're saying regional, would that include city HRAs as well? Yep. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Chair Hornstein.
Aye.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Ms. Beckman.
Aye.
Commissioner Bigham. Senator Coleman. Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Senator Dibble.
Aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Representative Cleavorn.
Aye.
Representative Koznick.
Aye.
Professor Orfield.
No.
Ms. Paddock.
Aye.
Ms. Pereira-Webb.
No.
Senator Port.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
Representative Weens.
Aye.
15 yes, 2 no.
15 ayes, 2 nays, the motion prevails. Okay, 2 final items. Commissioner Bingham,
Mr. Chair, this next one is a recommendation that I would like to include that in case that there isn't a governance change and there are just maybe some changes that move forward and related to the Met Council. This last one is in the spirit of continuing to have the 16 districts that currently exist under the current redistricted concept that we have that are all those that are currently serving going forward under a new, once a new term of an administration starts, we could have, out of those 16 districts, the local electeds would nominate up to 3 nominees. The districts would nominate up to 3 nominees. The governor would appoint a representative from that slate provided by that municipal committee. The Senate confirmation is required, and because of what law passed last year, the Senate has consented to the appointment if the Senate does not reject the appointment within 60 legislative days of receipt of the letter of appointment, because we know that the Senate has not quite acted sometimes, no matter who's in charge, has not quite acted on that. And I also want to throw a nod to the cities, throw a nod to the current folks that no requirement that that nominee be an elected official. So I wanted to include that in there. So I would ask for your support that this would help, I believe, with all the principles that we've put forward.
Senator Dibble, I was going to call on you.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think this is in the realm or the category of specific ideas for governance structure, as most of the proposals advanced included a description of a process for selection, or at least hinted at that. So this would hardwire an element and bake into any proposal this specific procedure. So I would be uncomfortable advancing this as a standalone. I wouldn't be uncomfortable attaching it to the Beckman motion as a suggestion for the legislature to consider as it looks at the totality of the governance proposals.
Right.
Mr. Chair, I kind of think he's trying to make a germaneness motion on me.
Yeah. Well, I think it is much more of a governance issue than a principle, I think. So I do agree with Senator Dibble on that.
Well, these were governance changes that we were continuing on other than the council structure. So that's why I left it as a standalone. But are you suggesting, Mr. Chair, are you suggesting that this probably should have been suggested in concert with Ms. Beckman's motion?
Yeah.
Chair. Commissioner Bigham, yes.
And Chair Cleavorn.
And I would just like to point out that this particular provision is already included in one of the other proposals, so it would be something that would be reviewed anyway, so I would respectfully ask you withdraw with the motion.
I can withdraw, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
The Bingham motion is withdrawn. Okay, I think we're on to Mr. Rockwell's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion recommendation is really a bridge between the principles and the governance. Right, I think what we have been talking about is governance structure, the structure of the organization. If you think about a corporation, structure of the corporation, having a great structure, if we don't have a clear purpose, a clear mission statement that delivers the work that we want it to deliver, that creates that framework, what's the point of the structure, right? And so this recommendation is to bring accountability, not just to the structure, but accountability to a mission as a benchmark against which we can judge Met Council's actions as they go forward. And so the motion is to create a comprehensive set of statutory goals that goes beyond the orderly and efficient economic growth goals that is more akin to some of the other MPOs that we have reviewed, that is akin to Minnesota Statute 174.01, which are the statutory goals for MnDOT, goals that include a clear vision for the future of the region and the work of the Metropolitan Council. I did not bring forth the specific recommendations around those goals. I think the legislature is capable of having that discussion and coming to some consensus around that, but I do think that it's really important that we expand upon that mission, that we articulate that mission, so that we understand what is the Metropolitan Council trying to do beyond just orderly and efficient growth. Why are we building affordable housing? Why are we building transit lines? Is this for climate purposes? Is this for equity purposes? What is this for? And articulating that from the legislature is something that's missing right now that exists for other entities.
I got the gavel.
Chair Pratt, you've got the gavel here.
Turn here. Is your mic on?
Professor Orfield.
I support in general the notion of goals. I mean, devil's in the details a lot in terms of these goals. The Metropolitan Land Use Planning Act is a very nice statute. It's a very good statute. It's got a lot of goals in it. Not that they've ever been really used, but you wonder what the goals are going to be. You wonder whether the goals can constrain an agency, whether they affect the operation. So in general, I think it would be good to have goals. I do also think that the Metropolitan Land Use Planning Act has goals, and there are important parts of the statute. Sometimes a person like me thinks they're unobserved, but there are. It is a nice statute.
Mayor Hovland.
Yeah, thank you. I was just making a note on the Metropolitan Land Use Planning Act. I was going to ask Professor Orfield if he had that statute in front of him on the enabling legislation on the Met Council, if there were goals embodied within that statute. I'm remote and don't have access to it here without getting off the call and going online. So I know from, again, being over there from experience and working on and participating in Thrive 2040. I mean, the Met Council is doing all of this work right now that Mr. Rockwell is alluding to. They are creating a comprehensive set of goals for our region and all the particular categories that they have jurisdiction over. And so I'm just uncertain as to what to think about it, as to whether or not there are goals that are already articulated statutorily that are sufficient, whether we need a comprehensive set of Met Council goals embodied in statutes, or whether there's that broad legislation that gives them the sort of authority that they have and have been exercising in creating a regional vision, because they've been good at that. I think that's one of the things they've been quite effective at is in creating a broad regional vision through the Thrive 2040 work that Representative Elkins discussed.
Back, I think Chair Cleavorn is.
I always say this whenever we're developing anything in statute, right? Are we making sure that we're being forward in our thoughts, right? Because we can put something into statute that this is a required goal, a statutory goal, but if we don't follow up with the purse to enable that goal, then we set them up for failure. So I just want to make sure that if we link a goal, that we are also making a recommendation that the funding stream go with it.
Chair Dibble.
Thank you. I would like to speak in favor of this motion while also agreeing with Professor Orfield and my good friend, Representative Cleavorn. There are already a number of, goals, and I think even Mayor Hovland talked about. There's already a lot in law to which we would hope that the Met Council would be held to account. Needs to be connected to funding, but it doesn't hurt to take a fresh look and make sure that it's up to date and it's easily understood and measured, and then, of course, the accountability piece, which is right there, concluding the paragraph. And I'll just mention that in my proposal, there's a mechanism for conducting that evaluation in, I think, a very powerful way by the COG that's proposed in my proposal. The evaluation piece to make sure that the services are being delivered effectively, efficiently, and upholding policy and law. And I'll just add parenthetically, we've heard a lot from Chair Cleavorn about, tying back to legislative authority and oversight and accountability, and this is where that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'd also like to highlight that, like Senator Dibble, this is encompassed in my proposal as well. But Mr. Rockwell, the question I have is we just passed a motion on performance measures, which to me would inherently be very similar to what we're talking about. Help me understand the differences between what we've already adopted and what we're trying to achieve here.
Absolutely. And I think that my answer addresses both that question and Professor Orfield's point, which is that I will point to the word comprehensive for the Metropolitan Council in here. Comprehensive, not land use goals, not transit goals, comprehensive goals. That's the difference. This is about high-level goals that guide that council as a whole. Vibrant communities, protecting the environment, climate, right? These are the goals that should guide all parts of the Metropolitan Council. And so I think there are good goals within the kind of individual jurisdictional responsibility areas of the Metropolitan Council. There are goals in the Thrive plans and in those long-term plans, but I think it's important to have those overarching goals and to have those apply across the different focus areas. And I do think that the goals make a difference. I've been in discussion with the Met Council, for example, on some legislation that passed last year. The Met Council noted that protecting the climate was not part of their charge. And so that was a noted argument against some of the work that we were working on. I think it's really important that we articulate whatever those goals are, again, those goals that cross over the entire council.
Thank you. We have Mayor Hovland, Professor Orfield, and then we're going to have to vote. Three of us have a meeting in 35 minutes. So members, if you want your stuff acted on, please make sure that your comments are brief. Mayor Hovland, Professor Orfield, and then we'll work.
And thank you, Mr. Rockwell. I'm wondering if this might be a way to resolve this issue in thinking about it. I think Member Rockwell's recommendation was that a comprehensive set of goals be created. And I'm wondering whether we should have it read instead, the legislature should determine whether a comprehensive set of goals for the Metropolitan Council planning for the future of the region should be embodied in legislation, so that we recommend the study of it as opposed to the creation of it.
Are you okay with that, Mr. Rockwell?
I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
Okay, so we'll have Ms. Kohler develop that. And could you just repeat that, Mayor Hovland?
Yes, that's fine. That captures what I was trying to convey.
Could you just repeat again?
So
what-
whether to
Either one
study-
of you
yeah,
could,
yeah. To study, the legislature should study whether to establish a comprehensive set of statutory goals for the
Okay.
Metropolitan Council.
We'll have Professor Orfield and then we'll vote.
I have nothing to say.
Okay, thank you. All right. Any other questions, comments? Okay,
Chair Hornstein,
aye.
Senator Pratt,
No.
Ms. Beckman,
No.
Commissioner Bigham. No. Senator Coleman,
No.
Senator Dibble,
Yes.
Commissioner Green,
Aye.
Mayor Hovland,
Yes.
Representative Cleaborn,
No.
Representative Kosnick, Professor Orfield,
Aye.
Ms. Paddock,
Aye.
Ms. Pereira Webb,
No.
Senator Port,
Aye.
Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Rockwell,
Aye.
Representative Weens,
No.
eight yes, 9 no.
8 yes, 9 no, the motion does not prevail. Our last motion is Ms. Paddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is kind of a 40,000-foot view of the Met Council. The other day, I was looking at the Thrive MSP One Vision, One Metropolitan Region book. On the cover, it says Thrive MSP 2040 is the 30-year vision for our region. And then on the very last page, next to the inside cover, it says, the council's mission is to foster efficient and economic growth for a prosperous metropolitan region. And I do agree that a prosperous economy is important, but I think it's instrumental to something else. And what it's instrumental to is a high quality of life. When you make efficiency and economic growth your very top goal, you're going to prioritize that above safety, above environment, above disruption of people's lives, and above equity. Personally, I will say that I have seen that kind of messed up prioritization in almost all of the disputes that I have seen in my area and that I heard about in all the public testimony. So what I would propose is a recommendation that the Met Council adopt a vision that prioritizes quality of life. And I wrote more. I wrote out what that vision might be and what the mission might be as suggestions. A metro area in which residents enjoy a high quality of life, businesses thrive, and the environment is protected for the good of present and future generations. It should be for the good of all in the present and future generations. And then the mission could be to achieve this vision, the Met Council will collaborate and cooperate to foster a strong, resilient, and sustainable economy, excellent public services, fairness and equity, and responsible environmental stewardship. So I would move either the whole thing, or I could just move the very first line.
Discussion? Ms. Beckman.
Ms. Paddock, I don't know that it's ours to recommend a vision, given that we're supposed to be focused on a governance structure. So while I don't disagree with the sentiment, I'll be voting against it.
Mayor Hovland, Professor Orfield, Senator Dibble.
I agree with Ms. Beckman. I think it's, the place to be dealing with vision like this is at the Met Council itself and not at the state legislature in terms of the state legislature dictating what the vision should be for the region.
Okay, Professor Orfield and Senator Dibble.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment. Just like with the discussion of the goals, I think it's very important to know how these actually have an impact on things. And one of the criticisms I've had of the council plans is they become sort of long and verbose and hard to understand what they mean. You know, the older documents were in the 1960s and 70s and 80s relatively short and clear and understandable by everybody. So, I mean, part of this is we've got a bunch of statutes. We have a lot of goals. You know, although I'm a critic of the council, I think the statutes are pretty good, you know, and aren't paid attention. So I think we've had a lot of discussion about principles, but they're hard to translate into actions without quite a bit of care. So I think we should be careful.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you. I wanted to speak in favor. I view this largely in the same, with the same perspective as I do the Rockwell motion. I think it's in the same spirit, offered in the same spirit, and that's setting forth some principles and some purpose to the Met Council against which we would judge whether or not the Met Council is successful. And I think that's important. I think that's perfectly appropriate for this task force to do. I think it's unfortunate that the Rockwell motion didn't prevail. Kind of makes me wonder what we're doing here if we're not even setting forth some ideas for what we think the Met Council exists and against which we have measuring sticks to judge its success. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Bingham is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the difference, and I'm going to be supporting Ms. Paddock's vision because it's asking that the Met Council should adopt the vision. I think the difference is Rockwell said that the legislature should set goals. So I think there's a difference in who's going to be doing the job. So I'll be supporting this.
And keep in mind, it's a recommendation. Commissioner Green, and then I don't see anyone else online. So after Commissioner Green, we'll vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Paddock, for bringing this forward. I really appreciate the intent of what you're getting at here. The challenge for me is that quality of life means different things to different people. And I wonder, even as you were talking about sort of the genesis of this idea, how would this stack up against environmental goals, equity goals? What if we have to choose equity over quality of life, et cetera? And so I'm not sure it clarifies further the challenge that you've identified with the current Met Council's vision.
Okay. Ms. Paddock, I think you said you were open to, should we just move the first line, or what is?
I would move the first line.
Okay. So the motion is just simply the first line. The Met Council should adopt a vision that prioritizes quality of life. Any further discussion? Chair Cleveland.
I think this makes an assumption that isn't something that they look at already, quality of life.
You're right.
So thank you.
You're correct.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay.
Chair Hornstein?
Aye.
Senator Pratt?
No.
Ms. Beckman?
No.
Commissioner Bingham?
Yes.
Senator Coleman?
No.
Senator Dibble?
Yes.
Commissioner Green?
Nay.
Mayor Hovland?
Nay.
Representative Claiborne?
No.
Representative Koznick?
No.
Professor Orfield?
No.
Ms. Paddock?
Aye.
Ms. Pereira-Webb?
No.
Senator Port?
Aye.
Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Rockwell?
Aye.
Representative Weens?
No.
6 yes, 11 no.
6 ayes, 11 nays, the motion does not prevail. Okay, members, we're close to wrapping up, but I wanted to see if anyone else had any other motions or any other votes that they would like to take at this time, any other discussions. If not, I just want to review kind of where we're at and then give some announcements for the next meeting. Really, we've given a lot of work to Ms. Kohler, who's already working on the report, and thanks, Ms. Olson, for all of your work here. So what will be in the report will include, among other things, a record of our meetings and topics covered during those meetings, the recommendations we voted on and approved. There'll be an appendix with all the written testimony received, meeting minutes, and all of the proposals and recommendations submitted. And this draft report, we hope will be done by Sunday evening. And task force members can then will review the draft report, and if they have any suggestions for the draft, they should send them to Ms. Kohler by Tuesday, the 30th at 5 p.m. So do some reading. And then Ms. Kohler will then work to incorporate suggestions and then send out the final draft by Wednesday, the 31st. And task force members will need to review the final draft ahead of our meeting on February 1st. And February 1st, we will vote to approve the final report. It's also important to remember that as we review this report is not a bill with finalized legal language. It is intended to convey the work of the task force overall, and task force members should not get bogged down in wordsmithing this document. Members should try to keep feedback to Ms. Taylor substance-focused where possible. And so ultimately, the recommendations with the language that we approved will be clearly denoted in the report and apparent to the legislature. So for those that choose, you will have some homework before our next meeting. And if there are no other questions or process concerns, we are adjourned.